The man didn't even look at the children. He looked at Mara. Then he pulled out a folded paper from his coat pocket, the official registry form from the Harwick Frontier Settlement Office, and set it on the desk like he was filing a land claim. His name was Vernon Crow. He owned 40,000 acres, 3 cattle operations, and half the goodwill of every official in Carbon County, Wyoming. He was not accustomed to being told no. 7, he said. I'll take 7. The older ones. The younger 2 and the sick one go to the county home in Rawlins. That's my offer. Mara Whitaker stood on the other side of that desk with 9 children behind her and 4.6 in her coat pocket, and said nothing for a moment that felt like it lasted a week. No, she finally said. Vernon picked up the paper and folded it back into his coat. Then you'll be sleeping in a snowdrift tonight. He glanced at the clerk, who looked at the floor. Office closes in 20 minutes. He walked out without another word, and that was the 6th man who walked away. If you've ever stood in a room where every door just closed at once, if you've ever looked at the people counting on you and had no answer to give them, then you already know what Mara felt in that moment. This is her story, and it doesn't go the way anyone expected. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this one, because we bring you new ones every week, and some of them will stay with you for a long time. Like this video, drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I read every single one, and I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Mara Whitaker was 34 years old and had not slept through a full night since her husband Thomas died 11 months earlier. She wasn't the kind of woman who collapsed under things. She'd grown up on a hardscrabble farm in eastern Kansas, where the soil gave you nothing without argument, and she'd married Thomas at 19, knowing full well that ranching life in the territories wasn't soft. She had made her peace with hard. Hard she could manage. What she couldn't manage was the debt. Thomas had been a decent man and a worse businessman, and the combination had been quietly catastrophic for years before anyone knew how bad it had gotten. 3 bad harvests, 2 loans he'd refinanced without telling her, a neighbor who had co-signed something he shouldn't have and then died before it came due. Mara found out the full picture only after she buried her husband, when 2 creditors appeared at her door within the same week, and the papers they carried were not the kind you argued with. She spent 4 months trying to fight it. She sold what she could. She worked the land herself with the older children helping, Clara and Eli taking shifts like adults even though Clara was 16 and Eli was 14, and neither of them should have been carrying that weight. She wrote letters. She appeared at the county office. She found a lawyer in town who charged her $40 to tell her that she had no real grounds for appeal because the debt had been legally transferred into her late husband's estate, and his estate was now hers. By February, she understood that staying was not a choice she still had. The Frontier Settlement Program had been advertised in the County Gazette in a small notice that most people skipped over. It wasn't the kind of thing that sounded dignified. Mara read it 3 times before she allowed herself to think about it seriously. Widows and unmarried women of good standing could apply for placement in frontier settlements across Wyoming and the Nebraska territories, where ranchers and landowners were seeking partners for household establishment. The language was careful. The reality, everyone understood, was simpler. Men who needed wives, women who needed homes. Mara had spent a week not sleeping over that notice. She was not looking for rescue. That was the thing she kept having to explain to herself, when the shame of it rose up in her throat. This was not rescue. This was logistics. She had 9 children who needed to eat and sleep and have a roof over their heads, and she had exhausted every other option. This was the one door still standing. She wrote the letter. She listed the children by name and age: Clara, 16, Eli, 14, the twins Henry and May, 11, George, 10, Ruth, 8, Lily, 6, Samuel, 4, and Caleb, who had just turned 3, and whose lungs had never been quite right since a chest cold the winter before last. She did not hide a single child. She wrote all 9 names. The settlement office in Harwick wrote back 3 weeks later. They had several candidates willing to correspond. They were careful to mention, twice, that most arrangements were made with smaller family situations. They were careful not to say outright that 9 children was a problem. It was a problem. Mara took what remained from the sale of the farm equipment less than she'd expected because the mark was soft and the equipment was old, bought 9 train tickets, and packed everything she owned into 2 trunks and a crate. Clara helped her. Eli refused to help, and then helped anyway in the middle of the night when he thought no one could see him. The train ride took 3 days and involved 2 layovers in conditions that were not comfortable. Caleb developed a cough on the 2nd day that made Mara's chest tighten every time she heard it. Samuel got into an altercation with a boy 2 cars down over a piece of candy and had to be retrieved from a very irate family. Ruth spent most of the ride talking to a man with a horse story who was more than happy to describe every horse he had ever owned in elaborate detail. And Mara let her because it kept Ruth occupied and calm. Lily sat beside Mara the whole way with her small shoulder pressed against Mara's arm and didn't say much. Lily hadn't said much since Thomas died. The doctors in Kansas had called it grief withdrawal and told Mara it would resolve on its own. 6 months later, it still hadn't resolved. Lily talked when she had to. She watched things carefully. But the child who used to sing to herself while doing chores had gone quiet in a way that nothing had fixed. Mara held her on the train and didn't push her to talk. The storm hit before they reached Harwick. It came out of the northwest the way Wyoming storms did, without much ceremony. Just a shift in the light, and then suddenly the sky was another color, and the wind had opinions. By the time the train pulled into the Harwick station, it was past 4 in the afternoon, and the temperature had dropped enough that Mara could see her breath inside the station building, which was not a good sign. The settlement office operated out of a back room in the station. It was staffed by a man named Aldous Pemberton, who was approximately 60 years old, wore a coat that had seen better decades, and had the particular expression of a man who had delivered bad news so many times that his face had given up pretending it was anything else. He saw Mara and the 9 children come through the door, and his expression went through several complicated stages before settling into something that was trying to be professional. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Pemberton," she said. He counted the children. She watched him do it. He was subtle about it, but not subtle enough. "Right," he said. "Well, let's get started." The first man arrived within the hour. His name was Duncan Reeves, and he had a medium-sized operation about 12 miles northeast of Harwick. He was in his early 50s, weathered in the way that men who worked outside got weathered, and he seemed decent enough for the first 5 minutes. Then he counted the children too, not subtly at all, and asked Pemberton how the settlement office handled situations where the family was, as he put it, beyond practical scope. Pemberton explained that the arrangement was at the discretion of the applicants. Duncan looked at Mara. "How many are yours by blood?" "All of them," she said. He asked the question a different way, because he hadn't understood. She answered it the same way because she had. He left. The second man came an hour after that. He looked at the children longer than Duncan had. He asked whether the older ones were already placed in work. Morris explained that they were children and not yet placed in anything except school when school was available. He mentioned that a lot of frontier families started their older boys early, and that 14 was not too young to be useful on a cattle operation. Mara's voice didn't change. "He's not a labor arrangement." "He's my son." "Of course," the man said in a tone that suggested he didn't mean it. He spoke to Pemberton for a few minutes in a low voice and then left. The third man didn't make it past the doorway. He looked at the assembled group, said "That's 9, in a tone of pure mathematics, and told Pemberton he'd been given incorrect information. He was gone in under 2 minutes. The storm outside had gotten serious by this point. The windows of the station had gone white. Pemberton kept looking at the door with the expression of someone hoping for a cavalry that might not come. The fourth man, whose name Mara never quite caught, asked if some of the younger children might be placed with other families as a kindness to them, more resources, more attention, a fresh start. He said it gently, in the manner of someone who had convinced himself he was being helpful.
Mara looked at him for a moment. "You're asking me to give away my children?"
"I'm suggesting an arrangement that might benefit." "No," she said. He tried 3 more angles. She said no to all of them with the same word in the same tone, which was very calm and very final. He left. The fifth man was someone Mara might have considered in different circumstances. He was quiet. He listened. He looked at the children with something that wasn't quite warmth, but wasn't dismissal either. But when he asked how many, and she told him, and he sat with that for a moment, she watched something in his face do the math and come up short. He apologized. He actually apologized, which was more than anyone else had done. And then he left. And then came Vernon Crow. She hadn't known his name before he walked through the door, but she learned it quickly because he said it himself, immediately before Pemberton could introduce him. Vernon Crow, like he was filing paperwork, like his name was something official. He was in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of confidence that didn't come from being good at things, but from never having been told he wasn't. He wore good boots and a good coat, and carried himself with the comfortable authority of a man who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around him. He didn't look at the children the way the others had, counting, calculating, retreating. He looked at Mara first. Just Mara. And then he looked at the children the way a man looks at inventory. 7, he said. "I'll take 7, the older ones." The room went very quiet. The children had been making small noises until that point, Caleb shifting in his chair, Samuel kicking the leg of the bench, the twins whispering to each other. All of that stopped. "The younger 2 and the sick one," Vernon continued, with no change in his voice, "go to the county home in Rawlins. Mara heard Caleb make a small sound behind her. She didn't turn around. No, she said. Vernon looked at her with the particular patience of a man who expects to hear no exactly once. Mrs. Whitaker, I have the largest operation in Carbon County. What I'm offering those 7 children is better than anything else they'll see in this territory. I'm not asking you to abandon them. I'm asking to be practical. I won't leave one behind, she said it quietly, but without any softness in it. He studied her. The sick one will be dead before spring. The room absorbed that statement. Mara heard Clara's sharp intake of breath. She heard Eli's chair scrape back an inch. She looked at Vernon Crow and said nothing. He waited. He was the kind of man who waited well, who understood that silence was pressure, who had used it on enough people to know that most of them broke before he did. Mara did not break. After a long moment, Vernon picked up the settlement form and folded it back into his pocket. He glanced at Pemberton, who was staring very hard at his desk. Office closes in 20 minutes, Vernon said. He buttoned his coat. Think about what I said. He walked out. The room after Vernon left was a particular kind of quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The quiet of 9 children who had just heard something no child should hear, said about one of their own, trying to figure out what their faces were allowed to do. Caleb was 3. He hadn't understood the words. But Lily, who was 6 and understood more than she let on, had gone the color of old flour. Ruth was crying silently, which she did sometimes when she was very upset, just tears. No sound, like she was conserving something. George had his arms crossed and was staring at the door Vernon had walked out of. Eli stood up. Sit down, Mara said quietly without turning around. He said, I heard him. Sit down. He sat. He was still coiled like a spring. 14-year-old boys who had lost their fathers and spent a year watching their world disassemble, coiled like that, and it took a long time to unwind. Pemberton was already checking the clock on the wall. He had the particular discomfort of a man who feels responsible for a situation he didn't create and can't fix. Mrs. Whitaker, he said carefully, the office protocol for tonight. I understand the protocol, she said. There's a boarding situation on Clement Street that takes... How much? He told her. She did the math, $4.60. The boarding house was $2 a night. She didn't say anything for a moment. I'll figure something out, she said. Pemberton nodded with the expression of a man who very much doubted that but didn't feel he could say so. He began shuffling his papers. Outside, the storm had fully arrived. The wind was no longer announcing itself. It had settled in. Mara turned around and looked at her children. Clara was already gathering the younger ones. That was Clara. She moved toward work the way other people moved toward exits. Eli was still tense but contained. The twins were pressed together the way they always were when things were bad, like they were generating warmth between them. George had stopped staring at the door and was now watching Mara with the steady, careful attention of a boy who was trying to read whether there was still a plan. She needed them to see that there was still a plan, even if she didn't have one yet. Put your coats on, she said. We're going to think. The station had a waiting area that wasn't officially closed yet. Mara settled the younger children on 2 benches pushed together and sat across from them and tried to think with the focused desperation of a woman who had exactly 40 minutes before a government office closed, in a blizzard and no good options in any direction. She wasn't going to split the children. That was not a decision she was making tonight or any night. She'd made it before she ever wrote the letter to the settlement office, before she ever packed the trunks, before the train, before any of it. It would not be separated. If that meant something hard, it would mean something hard. She was trying to figure out exactly what kind of hard she was looking at. Clara came and sat beside her, 16 and already carrying herself like a woman 20 years older. It was one of the things Mara felt guilty about, the way Clara had grown up sideways since Thomas died, not forward into girlhood, but sideways into responsibility. She could cook a full meal and manage a household budget and settle disputes between the younger children with a patience that most adults didn't have. She had not been to anything resembling school in 8 months. The boarding house, Clara said quietly. Too much. For one night, we don't have one night of money. We have $1 and change left after supplies for the trip. Clara processed this with no visible expression. What about the church? No. Clara nodded. She understood. Mara didn't take charity if she could avoid it. Not because she was too proud to need help, but because she'd learned young that charity came with an arithmetic she couldn't always pay back. Then we stay here until they make us leave, Clara said. That's what I'm thinking. They looked at each other. It wasn't a good plan, but it was a plan which was better than nothing. That was when the door opened. The man who came through it was covered in snow, not dusted covered, like he'd been standing in the storm for some time, or like he'd ridden through it, which turned out to be exactly what he'd done. He was large in the particular way of men who did physical work for a living and didn't think much about it. Not fat, just built like something that expected to be useful. He had maybe 15 years on Mara, which would put him somewhere in his 50s, and a face that had been through weather both literal and otherwise. He stomped snow off his boots and pulled off his coat and looked around the station with the calm attention of a man who was used to assessing situations without announcing that he was doing it. His eyes landed on the children first, not Mara. The children. He didn't count them. That was the first thing she noticed. He looked at them the way you look at people, taking them in whole, not the way you look at a problem you're calculating. Pemberton appeared from his back room with the expression of someone who had genuinely not expected any more visitors tonight. Mr. Boone Aldous. The man Boone was still looking at the children. Train was late getting in. Roads are worse than expected. He looked at Pemberton. I was told there was a family. Mrs. Whitaker, Pemberton said carefully. From Kansas. Boone turned to Mara then. Just turned and looked at her straight on. Not sizing her up, not calculating, just looking. Mrs. Whitaker, he said. Mr. Boone, she said, and then he did something that none of the other 6 men had done. He walked over to the children and crouched down this large snow-covered man to be at the level of the smaller ones. Samuel was staring at him with the open fascination of a 4-year-old who had no self-consciousness. Caleb had pressed himself into Clara's side. Ruth had stopped crying and was watching him the way she watched new horses very carefully, from a safe distance. Tell me who they are, he said. Not to Pemberton, to Mara. She stared at him for a moment because no one had said that. Not one of the other 6 men had asked for names. Clara, she said. She's 16. Hello, Clara said, formal as a handshake, because that was how Clara handled uncertainty. The twins are Henry and May. They're 11. Henry nodded. May looked at Boone with the analytical expression she always wore when she was deciding something about a person. George, he's 10. George said nothing, which was unusual because George usually talked. Ruth lifted her chin very slightly. Lily pressed closer to Clara. Samuel waved, and Caleb. A beat, he's 3. Boone looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him from the security of Clara's side, still coughing that low cough that had been with him since the train. Boone didn't say anything about the cough. He didn't say anything about how many children there were. He stood back up, brushed some remaining snow from his sleeve, and looked at Mara. I rode in from the north, he said. I have a ranch. 1,200 acres, about 20 miles out. It's been a long time since there was a family in the house. Mara waited. I'm not going to stand here and make you a promise. I don't know if I can keep, he said. But I'm also not going to send 9 children out into that storm. He glanced toward the white windows. I'd like to propose a week. A week, she repeated. Come to the ranch, all of you. No promises, no paperwork, no conditions, he paused. I want to see how it works. You want to see how it works. After a week, we talk honestly about what we both think. Mara looked at this man for a long moment. She was trying to read him the way she'd learned to read people, not charitably, not cynically, just clearly. He didn't shift under the look. He didn't fill the silence with reassurances. What do you want in return? She asked. Honest assessment at the end of the week. That's all? That's all. She looked at the children. Eli was watching Boone with the measured suspicion he'd developed since Thomas died, which he applied to most adult men, and especially to any adult man who appeared to be offering something. Clara had the waiting expression she wore when she'd already made her own quiet decision and was watching Mara make hers. The twins were looking at each other in that sideways way they communicated. The station clock showed 12 minutes until closing. Outside, the storm made a sound against the walls like it was expressing an opinion. All right, Mara said. 1 week. Getting 9 children into a wagon in a blizzard was not a simple operation. Silas Boone, she thought of him as Silas now, which was the name Pemberton had used when writing out the transit papers, had brought a large wagon with a canvas cover. It wasn't comfortable, but it was enclosed enough to keep the worst of the wind out. He had a second horse tied to the back, which he'd ridden in on, and the practicality of having brought a covered wagon into a blizzard rather than just his riding horse told Mara something about him. He'd expected to bring people back with him. He'd planned for it. She filed that away. The loading process took longer than it should have because Samuel absolutely refused to get into the wagon until he'd been allowed to inspect the horses and had announced his official approval, which Silas waited for with complete patience. Caleb coughed through the whole procedure. Eli lifted the trunks into the back of the wagon without being asked, which Mara noted and said nothing about. George climbed in last and immediately found a position facing the rear where he could watch the road disappear behind them, which was exactly what George would do. Silas drove. Mara sat in the front of the wagon with him. They didn't talk much for the first few miles. The storm demanded attention. The horses knew the road, but the visibility was down to nearly nothing, and Silas drove the way he'd looked at the children carefully, steadily, without announcing what he was doing. How long have you had the ranch? Mara asked eventually. 19 years. Alona paused. That was not uncomfortable, exactly, but was aware of itself. My wife died 8 years ago. We didn't have children. Mara let that sit. I'm sorry. So was I, he said. Simple as that. Behind them, she could hear the children settling into the wagon in their various ways. The twins had apparently started a card game. George was asking Eli something in a low voice. Caleb's cough was steadying into the rhythmic sound she'd learned to monitor. Steady was manageable. That was the sound she was listening for. He's had that cough since last winter, she said, without explaining who she meant. Silas would understand. We'll get him warm, Silas said. Not we'll get him to a doctor, which would have been worried. Not I'm sure he'll be fine, which would have been empty. Just a practical statement about the immediate problem. She appreciated that. If this doesn't work out after the week, she said, I need to know you'll say so plainly. I will. I don't need gentle. I didn't figure you did, he said. The horses moved through the dark and the snow. 20 miles was a long ride in a blizzard with 9 children in a wagon, and Mara had a lot of time to think about what she was doing, and whether it was wise, and whether wisdom was even the right standard to apply, to a situation where all the alternatives were worse. She thought about Vernon Crow saying the sick one will be dead before spring. She thought about the way the room had gone quiet after that. She thought about how Silas Boone had come through the door, covered in snow, after riding through a blizzard, and had crouched down to ask the names of the children. Not a guarantee, not even a promise, just names. She looked out at the white dark and let that thought settle. The ranch materialized, out of the storm, like something that had been waiting. It was large. The barn was large, the house was large, and it had the particular look of a place that had been well built, and then worked hard, and then left standing by someone who understood that maintenance was a form of respect. The lights in the windows were already on. Someone had kept them burning. Silas said it was his foreman, Harlan Voss, who'd been there since the early years of the ranch. Mara heard that and said nothing. Foreman had opinions. She'd deal with those opinions when they arrived. The arrival itself was its own kind of chaos. Samuel needed to get down immediately and was immediately told no until the horses were settled. Caleb had fallen half asleep against Clara and had to be lifted down. Ruth climbed down on her own and then stood in the snow looking at the barn, with an expression that Mara recognized Ruth had that look near every barn she'd ever seen. Harlan Voss was waiting at the door of the house. He was a lean man, somewhere in his 60s, with the weathered self-containment of someone who had managed a ranch for a long time and developed opinions accordingly. He looked at the 9 children coming across the yard through the snow, and his face did something complicated. He didn't say anything, but the something complicated stayed on his face. Silas introduced everyone by name. He'd remembered all 9, every single one in order without hesitation. Harlan nodded at each one. He still hadn't said whatever the complicated thing was. Inside, the house was warm and smelled like wood smoke and something that had been cooking on the stove, and there was a table, large enough to be practical, if not quite large enough for 11 people. Harlan had clearly been cooking. There was a pot of something and biscuits and enough of both that Mara understood he'd also expected more people than just Silas. She looked at Silas. He looked at the stove, not at her. Harlan tends to make enough. She looked at Harlan, who was pretending not to be watching the children look at the food. Thank you, she said. He made a noise that was not quite words. Samuel didn't wait for formal permission to investigate the biscuits. Clara intercepted him. There was a brief negotiation in whispers, and then Samuel was seated and waiting with the focused attention of a child who knows the food is coming. Mara stood in the kitchen of a stranger's house in Wyoming at the end of the longest day she'd had in recent memory, with snow on her coat and $4 and change in her pocket and 9 children who needed to eat and sleep, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not safety, she didn't trust safety yet, but the possibility of it. That was enough for tonight. Dinner was not comfortable in the way that sitting with strangers never quite is when the stakes are real, but it was food, and there was enough of it, and the children were well enough behaved, even Samuel, to make it manageable. Harlan Voss did not soften during dinner. He answered direct questions directly and didn't volunteer anything extra, and he watched the children with the expression of a man who had decided to wait and see rather than commit to either welcome or rejection. Mara understood that and respected it more than she would have respected false warmth. After the younger children had been settled to sleep, a process that involved distributing them across 2 back rooms and configurations, that the older children organized themselves with only minor argument, Mara sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee Silas had made and thought about tomorrow. Clara came back from the settling and sat beside her. Eli came in, got a cup of coffee, leaned against the wall. Silas sat across the table. He wasn't trying to make conversation. He was just there. The horses, Ruth said from the doorway, still in her coat. Can I see them tomorrow? Silas looked at her with something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the direction of one. Come out with me in the morning. Ruth disappeared back to bed with a speed that suggested this was the outcome she'd been working toward. She's been like that since she could walk, Mara said. The horses will like her, Silas said. Simple as that. Clara stood up and took her cup to the sink, said good night in her careful, measured way. Eli followed without a word. That left Mara and Silas at the table with the quiet and the stove. "I want to ask you something," Mara said. "Go ahead. You rode through a blizzard tonight. You planned for this, the wagon, the lights, enough food. You came prepared for a family." He looked at his coffee cup. "Yes. Most of the men I talked to today came looking for a certain arrangement, a manageable one. I know what kind of arrangements most men are looking for." "What are you looking for?" He thought about that for a moment. Not deflecting, just actually thinking. "I'm looking to find out if a family can work on this land. I've got 1,200 acres and no good reason to be using it alone." He looked at her. "I'm not promising you anything tonight, Mrs. Whitaker. But I'm not asking you to be anything you're not, either." She sat with that. "Fair enough," she said. She went to bed in a stranger's house in Wyoming, in a room down the hall from 9 children who were finally warm, and she lay there listening to the storm blow itself out against the walls and thought about the week ahead. 1 week. She had survived worse than a week. She closed her eyes. Outside, the snow fell on 1,200 acres of possibility, covering everything equally, the pasture and the barn and the road, that had brought them here in the same white quiet. And somewhere in the back room, Caleb coughed once, then stopped, then slept. The morning after the blizzard arrived without ceremony. Mara woke before anyone else, which was her habit, had been since the children were small, and she'd learned that the hour before anyone else was awake was the only hour that fully belonged to her. She lay still for a moment in the unfamiliar room and listened to the quiet. The storm had blown itself out sometime in the night. She could tell by the particular texture of the silence, not the pressurized quiet of a house under weather, but the ordinary stillness of morning. She got up, found her boots, found the kitchen by memory since she'd been careful to notice the layout the night before. Silas was already there. He was at the stove and he was making coffee, and he didn't say anything when she came in except to gesture at the second cup he'd already set out. She sat down and accepted it, and they drank in silence for a while, which was not awkward so much as practical. Neither of them was the kind of person who filled silence because they were nervous about it. Outside the kitchen window, the yard had been transformed by a foot of snow. The barn was visible, but just barely. The fence lines had disappeared. "Roads?" she asked. "Passable by midday." Probably. He didn't sound certain, and she appreciated that he didn't pretend to be. "The north road takes longer." She looked at her coffee. "Caleb slept through the night. I heard him settle around 2. She looked up at that. He'd been listening too. She didn't know what to do with that information, so she filed it away. "I want to be clear about something," she said. He waited. "This week I'm not going to perform for you. I'm not going to have the children on their best behavior and pretend everything is easier than it is. You want an honest assessment at the end. You'll need to see an honest week." He looked at her with that steady, unreadable expression. "I wasn't expecting a performance. Some men do. I'm sure they do." He drank his coffee. "I'm not asking for one." She nodded. That was enough. Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:15 in her coat, which she had put on before anyone had told her. Breakfast was ready or not ready or anything else. She looked at Silas with the focused determination of someone who had made a plan during the night and was now executing it. "You said morning," she said. "I did," he said. "It's morning." "It is." He stood up and set down his cup. "Put on your second pair of socks." Ruth vanished to find her second pair of socks. Silas carried his cup to the sink. "She's 8, Mara said. "Not a warning, exactly. More information." "I know," he said. "The horses will be fine with her." He went to get his coat. The rest of the children woke in stages, which was how it always went. Clara was second after Mara, arriving in the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been managing the morning routine for so long it had become reflex. She assessed the stove, the coffee, the supplies visible in the kitchen, and began making calculations without being asked. "How much is there?" Mara asked. "Enough for 2 weeks if we're reasonable." Clara opened another cabinet. "More than enough for one." Harlan Voss came in from outside at 7, with snow on his coat and the expression of a man who had been managing expectations his whole life and had strong feelings about adding variables. He looked at Clara at the stove and said nothing. He looked at the twins, who had appeared, and immediately begun investigating the kitchen with the analytical thoroughness of people who wanted to understand how a system worked. "The stove needs a new gasket on the left side," Henry said. Harlan looked at him. "I know, we could fix it." "You could. Do you have the parts?" Harlan studied Henry with the particular expression of a man who was revising his assessment of something. "Workshop behind the barn." Henry looked at May. May looked back at Henry. Something was communicated between them that didn't require words. After breakfast, Clara said, not looking up from the stove. The twins sat down. George arrived next, carrying a book he'd found somewhere, which meant he'd already been exploring. Mara noticed this but said nothing. George exploring meant George was comfortable enough to be curious. That was a good sign. Where'd you get that? Eli asked, coming in behind him. Shelf in the back room. It's about land surveys. George looked genuinely pleased about this. Did you know that the Wyoming land survey system is different from the Kansas? Put it back when you're done, Mara said. I was going to. I know you were. I'm just saying it. Silas came back inside with Ruth trailing behind him, both of them snow-covered. Ruth's face had the particular shine of a person who has just had an experience they intend to carry for a long time. She sat down at the table without being asked and didn't say anything, which for Ruth meant the horses had exceeded her expectations. Well, George asked. There's a bay mare, Ruth said. She's difficult. George processed this, and I'm going to work with her. Silas said nothing, just went to wash his hands at the basin, but Mara caught the faint adjustment in his expression. Not surprise. More like confirmation of something. The first real friction of the week came from Harlan Voss, and it came on the second day, and it was not dramatic in the way that Vernon Crow had been dramatic. It was quieter and more sustained, and in some ways harder to address because Harlan wasn't saying anything wrong. Exactly. He said it to the ranch hand named Davies while Mara was close enough to hear, and Harlan either didn't know or didn't care. 9 kids in a working ranch, Harlan said. He wasn't loud about it. He was the opposite of loud. He had the tone of a man making observations in a ledger. You run the numbers, feed alone, the little one's sick. Winter's not half done. Davies said something Mara couldn't quite catch. It's not about wanting, Harlan said. It's about what's practical. Mara kept walking. She did not stop. She did not turn around. She had learned a long time ago that the worst thing you could do in the face of that kind of assessment was react to it publicly, because then the argument became about your reaction and not about whether the assessment was right. She did file it away. That evening she asked Silas, as plainly as she could manage, whether his foreman was going to be a problem. Silas was cleaning a bridle. He didn't stop what he was doing. Harlan says what he thinks. I know that. I'm asking if what he thinks is going to make the week harder than it needs to be. Probably, Silas said. He'll watch and then he'll revise. That's how he works. And if he doesn't revise, Silas looked up. Then I'll have a conversation with him. But I don't think it'll come to that. Mara wasn't certain, she agreed, but she let it sit. The next morning she found Harlan in the workshop, looking at the stove gasket that Henry and May had apparently already removed, cleaned, and replaced the previous afternoon using parts they'd found themselves without asking anyone. It was sitting in its fitting sealed, the small gap that had been losing heat now closed. Harlan touched the repair with 2 fingers, tested the fit. He didn't say anything. But the way he looked at the stove after that was slightly different than the way he'd looked at everything else. The problem with 9 children and a working ranch was that the ranch had been designed around 2 adults, one of whom was now gone. The house had 4 rooms that could be slept in, which was workable but barely. The kitchen managed. The barn was large enough, which was fortunate, because Ruth spent more time in it than in the house by the 3rd day. And Silas had stopped discouraging this and started showing her things instead, which Ruth absorbed with the intensity of a person who had finally found their subject. The harder problem was Eli. Eli moved through the first 3 days of the week like a man waiting to be disappointed. He helped without being asked, which people sometimes mistook for willingness. But Mara knew her son well enough to understand that his help was a form of armor if he did things before he was told to. No one could tell him to, and therefore no one had power over him. He worked hard, he didn't complain. He also didn't talk to anyone he didn't have to, and he watched Silas with the specific wariness of a boy who had decided that the safest thing to do with men who seemed decent was to keep waiting for the part where they weren't. Silas didn't push him. That was the thing Mara noticed. He didn't try to win Eli over, didn't make efforts at friendliness that would have been transparent and therefore counterproductive. He just worked the ranch and let Eli watch. On the 4th day, there was a fence problem in the north pasture 2 posts down under the weight of snow, which meant the section needed to be reset before the ground froze solid around the new positions. Silas went out after breakfast with 2 of the ranch hands. He didn't ask Eli to come. Eli watched from the yard for about 20 minutes. Then he went and got his coat. Mara saw him go from the kitchen window. She said nothing. The fence work took most of the morning. When they came back for lunch, Eli's coat was muddy up to the elbow, and he had the particular quietness of a boy who has worked hard at something real and doesn't know what to do with how it felt. He ate without talking. Silas ate without talking. The ranch hands talked about the fence. Afterward, when the table was being cleared, Silas said to Eli, "The east section's probably the same. After the ground softens a little." Eli looked at him. Okay, that was all. But Mara heard it from the other room and understood that something had shifted by about 2 degrees, which didn't sound like much but was, in the mathematics of a 14-year-old boy who had spent a year building walls, a considerable distance. George found the books on the 3rd day. Not just the land survey volume he'd already claimed, but the shelf in Silas's study and actual study. A small room off the main hallway, with a desk that had papers on it, and shelves that had books on them, real books. Not the almanac and the single Bible that had constituted the library in their Kansas farmhouse. George stood in the doorway the first time and looked at the shelves like a person who has discovered water after a long dry spell. Then he looked at Silas, who had appeared behind him. "May I?" George asked. "There's no lock on the door," Silas said, which was not yes, but was also clearly not no. George took it as permission and spent the better part of 2 days reading through titles and making selections with the serious methodology of someone who was working through a problem. By the 5th day, he had opinions about Wyoming land policy, the history of the Transcontinental Railroad, and the particular legal complications of frontier homestead claims. He shared these opinions at dinner because George shared opinions at dinner. Mar watched Silas listen to a 10-year-old hold forth about land survey law and noted that he didn't look bored or patronizing. He asked George a question, a genuine one about a dispute he'd had with a neighboring claim some years back. George had a theory. Silas considered the theory. "That's not wrong," he said. George ate the rest of his dinner with the contained satisfaction of someone who has been taken seriously. The moment with Caleb came on the 5th night. He'd been doing well, relatively. His cough had settled into the familiar pattern. Mara knew worse in the morning, better by afternoon, manageable with the warmth of the house and the dry indoor air of a Wyoming winter. She watched him the way she always watched him, which was constantly, and with the specific anxiety of a mother who had been told too many times that this cough was nothing serious, and had learned not to entirely believe it. The 5th night she woke at 2 in the morning to a sound she knew, not the steady rhythmic cough, the other kind, the wet, labored kind that meant his lungs were doing something they shouldn't. She was up before she was fully awake, moving through the dark to the room where Caleb was sleeping. She got her hand on his forehead and felt the heat under her palm, and her stomach went cold. He was burning. She didn't panic. She had learned not to panic, because panic was a luxury you couldn't afford when you were the only adult. She got him sitting up, got him drinking water, got her mind working through what she had available and what she needed. The ranch had basic supplies she'd checked on arrival, the way she always checked. Harlan kept a medicine chest. There was willow bark. There was a salve that might help with the chest if she heated it. These were things she could do right now. What she could not do right now was get to a doctor. The nearest one was in Harwick, 3 hours by wagon in good conditions. The conditions outside were not good. A sandstorm had been building since yesterday. She could hear it in the walls. She was sitting on the edge of Caleb's bed with her hand on his chest, feeling his breathing and trying to decide how bad this was and how long she could manage before bad became worse when the floorboard outside the room shifted. Silas appeared in the doorway. He was dressed, not in bedclothes dressed like he'd been awake. He looked at Caleb and then at Mara, and he read the situation the way he seemed to read most situations, quickly and without a lot of visible processing. "How long?" he asked. "Maybe an hour. His temperature's high." Silas came in and put his own hand on Caleb's forehead, which surprised her, not an intrusive gesture, just the automatic assessment of someone who wanted to know the facts. "Has he been like this before?" "Once, 2 winters ago. He needed a doctor." Silas looked at her. "I'll go." The words sat between them. "It's the middle of the night," Mara said. "In a storm. I know, it's dangerous." "I know that too." He looked at Caleb, who was awake now, or half awake, his eyes moving but not quite focusing. "If he's been like this before and needed a doctor, he needs one now." Mara opened her mouth and then closed it because she had been about to argue, and she didn't actually disagree with him. She had been trying to calculate how long she could manage without the ride, and the answer she kept getting was not long enough. "Take someone with you," she said. "Davies knows the road." He was already moving toward the door. "Silas." He stopped. She didn't know exactly what she'd meant to say. "There were several things. Be careful. Thank you. I don't know how to do this. I'm not used to this." She settled on the simplest one. "Come back." He looked at her for a moment. "I intend to," he said, then he was gone. The next 4 hours were the longest of the week, and arguably the longest of the entire year since Thomas had died. Clara was up within minutes, not because Mara had woken her, but because Clara had the same instinct. Mara had. She woke when things needed attending. She took over the warm compresses and the monitoring in a smooth transition that required no discussion. Mara moved between Caleb's room and the kitchen, heating things, preparing what she could, listening to the storm. Eli woke at 4 and came to the kitchen and said nothing. He sat at the table and waited. That was what he did when things were bad. Eli sat and waited and was present, which was not nothing. In fact, it was more than a lot of people managed. Harlan Voss came in from the bunkhouse at 4:30. He looked at Eli, he looked at Mara, he looked at Caleb's door. "I know," he said, "not to anyone in particular." He went to the stove and put more wood in it. He checked the medicine chest and said nothing about its contents, just made sure it was within reach. He was not warm about it. He did it like a man doing an inventory, precise and unsentimental. But he did it. The twins stayed in their room because Mara had asked them to, which they did without argument, which told her they understood this was serious. George fell back asleep because George could sleep through significant stress once he'd assessed that he wasn't personally needed, which was a quality Mara sometimes envied. Ruth did not sleep. Ruth sat in the hallway outside Caleb's room with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up, and she waited in her particular way, which was still and watchful. She didn't ask anything, she just stayed. Caleb's fever climbed toward morning. Not fast, but steady. Clara monitored it with the focused calm she brought to everything. And around 5, she looked at Mara with the expression that meant she was calculating something she didn't like. Another 2 degrees, Clara said quietly. Mara knew what that meant. She'd been trying not to know it for the last hour. He'll be okay, Ruth said from the hallway. Mara looked at her. He's always okay, Ruth said, like a statement of fact. Like she was explaining the physics of something. Mara didn't answer, because she didn't want to make a promise she couldn't keep, and she didn't want to frighten Ruth by correcting her. She just looked at her 8-year-old daughter sitting in the cold hallway at 5 in the morning and thought that children were both more fragile and more durable than you could ever predict. The sound of horses in the yard came at 6:15. Mara was at the door before Silas had finished tying up. He had snow to his shoulders, and his face had the gray look of a man who has been cold for a very long time. Behind him, Davies looked worse. Between them, half-supported, was a man Mara didn't know, mid-50s, carrying a black bag, wearing the expression of someone who had been dragged out of bed in a blizzard and made his peace with it. Dr. Emmett Hale. He confirmed the name himself before he'd even fully cleared the doorway, because he had the particular efficiency of a man who understood that time spent introducing himself was time not spent on the problem. He went directly to Caleb. Mara followed. Silas came in behind her, stripping off his frozen coat, saying us nothing, just present in the way he'd been present all week there when he was needed. Quiet when quiet was the right thing. Dr. Hale examined Caleb with the brisk thoroughness of someone who'd been doing this for 30 years. He listened to his chest with the instrument he pulled from his bag. He took his temperature. He asked Mara questions. When did the cough start? How long had it been like this? Any previous episodes? And Mara answered them all clearly and quickly, because she had been keeping track for years and could give him a complete history without notes. He looked at her when she finished. Good record keeping, he said. Surprised maybe, or just acknowledging. He's my son, she said. Pneumonia, Dr. Hale said, early stages but established. We caught it. He looked at Caleb, who was watching him with feverish attention. You're going to feel worse before you feel better, he told Caleb in the straightforward tone of someone who treated small children as capable of receiving truth. But you're going to feel better. Caleb considered this. Will it hurt? Some of the medicine tastes bad. But will it hurt? Not much. Caleb seemed to decide this was acceptable. The treatment took most of the morning. Dr. Hale stayed until he was satisfied the fever had stopped climbing, instructed Mara in considerable detail about the medication schedule and the warning signs that would require him to return, and drank 2 cups of coffee that Clara made without being asked. He spoke to Mara the entire time, not to Silas, which she noted and appreciated. When he was ready to leave, he took Silas aside for a conversation Mara could partially see from the kitchen. Whatever was said, Silas nodded. The doctor left with Davies driving him back through the remaining snow. Silas came back inside and sat down at the kitchen table. He had the stillness of a man who has been running on something other than rest for a long time and has just stopped moving. He looked tired in a way that he hadn't looked before. What did he say? Mara asked. That the boy has strong lungs for someone with weak ones. He looked at his hands. And to keep him warm. What else? A pause. That we got there in time. Mara sat down across from him. The house had the particular quality of the aftermath of a crisis, the specific quiet that settles when the emergency is over, but the bodies haven't caught up to the good news yet. She could hear Ruth in the back room talking to Caleb in the low, steady voice she'd been using all morning. She could hear the twins in the kitchen doing something that involved a lot of discussion. You rode into that storm for my son, she said.
Yeah.
You don't know us. We've been here 5 days, Silas looked at her. He had the expression of a man who was choosing his words, not because he was being careful exactly, but because he meant them to land correctly. I rode into that storm because a child was sick and the doctor was in Harwick. That's the whole of it. It could have been dangerous. It was dangerous, he said. I've ridden in worse. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something she'd been thinking about since the night she'd watched him ride out into the dark, something she'd been holding at a distance because she didn't entirely trust it. But it kept coming back. She said, You're not what I expected. What did you expect? I don't know exactly. She thought about it honestly. Better terms, more conditions, a clearer arrangement. You'll find I'm not much for conditions, he said. I'm starting to notice. The stove made a sound. Outside, the storm was finally quieting that particular exhalation of winter, when a system moves through and the pressure drops, and the whole landscape seems to exhale with it. You said a week, Mara said. It's been 5 days. It has. How do you think it's going? He considered. Your son Henry's a better mechanic than anyone I've had working the ranch. May runs numbers in her head faster than Harlan does on paper, and Harlan won't admit it yet, but he's noticed. George is going to read every book I own and probably ask for more. Ruth, he stopped. Something shifted in his expression. Ruth has a gift. I haven't seen anyone handle that bay mare the way she did this morning. She went to the barn this morning? After being up all night? She was there when I got back. The mare was calm. He said it in the tone of someone reporting a remarkable fact. She's been difficult for 2 years. Mara thought about her 8-year-old daughter in a Wyoming barn at 6 in the morning after a night of crisis, calming a difficult horse by presence alone. She thought about how that was exactly who Ruth had always been, and how she'd never had the right environment for it until now. And the other, she asked? Clara carries too much for her age. You know that, I know. Lily doesn't say much, but she watches everything. He paused. There's a harmonica in the study. She found it yesterday. I heard her in there for an hour. Mara stared at him. She played it, she figured it out. He said this simply, she's got a good ear. Mara didn't say anything for a moment. Lily. Her Lily, who hadn't sung since Thomas died, who had gone so quiet that Mara sometimes woke in the night with the fear that the child had simply sealed herself off from things permanently, in a stranger's study, with a harmonica. Can she keep it? Mara asked, before she'd fully decided to ask. Silas looked at her. I was going to suggest it. Caleb's fever broke on the 6th morning, which was the morning before the week ended. It broke the way fevers broke, not with a dramatic moment, but with a gradual lessening, a slowdown, a color returning to his face that had been absent. He woke up on the 6th morning and asked for something to eat, which was how Mara always knew. When a sick child asks for food, they've turned the corner. She made him oatmeal. He ate it with the focused attention of someone reclaiming territory. Then he asked if he could see the horses. When you're stronger, Mara said. How much stronger? Considerably. Caleb accepted this with the philosophical patience he sometimes showed when he understood that arguing would not work. Is it a nice barn? Asked Ruth. Ruth, who was sitting at the table, said, It's a very nice barn. Are the horses nice? One of them is difficult, Ruth said. But I'm working on her. Caleb considered this. Okay. Silas heard this conversation from the doorway. He didn't come in. He just stood there for a moment and then went back to whatever he'd been doing. And if there was something in his expression that was more than just the observation of a man watching a child recover something softer and more complicated, Mara caught it and said nothing. The conversation she'd been expecting came on the 6th afternoon. It came from Harlan. She was in the yard looking at the north fence line that Eli and Silas had been working on when Harlan appeared beside her. He had the expression of a man who had made a decision and was executing it, uncomfortable but committed. You heard me, said. What I said to Davy, 2nd day. Wasn't a question. Mara looked at him. I heard you. Harlan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fence. I've been managing this ranch since before Silas's wife died. 8 years since, and before that 4 more. I know what this place can carry. I know. Too many, she said. I understand. He looked at her. He had the expression of a man who was discovering that a conversation he'd expected to be difficult had taken an unexpected turn. Your twins fixed a problem I've been putting off for 3 months. Henry notices systems, she said. May notices numbers. It's how they're built. The boy Eli. He's got good hands on the fence post. He does. Harlan looked back at the fence line. I'm not saying I was wrong to think what I thought. You don't have to, Mara said. You were being practical. I understand practical. He seemed to consider whether this was satisfactory. Apparently it was, because he nodded once. The little one's going to need watching. Caleb, he always does. I know where the medicine chest is. She looked at him. He was already turning to go back to the barn, which was the furthest he was going to go in the direction of a declaration of support. And she understood that about him completely, because she was the same way. Harlan, she said. He stopped. Thank you for keeping the stove going. He made the sound that wasn't quite words. Then he went into the barn. The 7th day was quiet in a way that felt earned. The children had settled into the ranch in their various ways, not comfortably, not entirely, because a week wasn't long enough for comfortable, and Mara was honest enough not to pretend otherwise. But they had stopped bracing for the next disruption. Even Eli had stopped watching the exits quite so intently. Mara walked the property in the morning alone. Silas had offered to come with her, and she'd said she wanted to go by herself, which he'd accepted without comment. She walked the fence lines and the pasture edge and the long slope behind the barn where the land opened up into the kind of view that made you understand why people had come to Wyoming in the first place, despite all the evidence that it was hard. She thought about Thomas. She did that honestly. Not softly. Thomas was not a saint, and she had stopped making him one. He had been a decent man who made bad decisions with money and who had loved her and the children in the distracted, well-meaning way of someone who was always slightly overwhelmed by the size of what he'd taken on. She had loved him. She also had to acknowledge, standing on a Wyoming hillside in the remnant snow of a storm that had nearly taken her youngest child, that the choices that had brought her to this hillside had originated in his choices. That was not blame. It was just the truth, and she was too tired for anything other than truth. She looked out at the 1,200 acres and thought about what George had told her about frontier homestead law, which was more than she'd ever planned to know, and which had lodged in her brain anyway. She thought about Clara making calculations in the kitchen, about Henry and May in the workshop, about Ruth in the barn before sunrise, about Lily in the study with a harmonica, finding her way back to sound. She stood there for a long time. When she came back to the house, Silas was on the porch, not waiting, exactly doing something with his hands, fixing a piece of tackle, but positioned where he'd see her when she came back across the yard. She climbed the porch steps. Well, he said, not pushing, just asking. Mara looked at him. She thought about the week, the storm, the fence work, the doctor in the dark, the horses, the books, the harmonica, the way Harlan had stoked the stove, the way Eli had picked up a fence post without being asked, the way Caleb had asked if it was a nice barn. I'm going to need to go into Harwick, she said. There are some things I need to put in order. Silas looked at her steadily. About the settlement paperwork? Among other things. He was quiet for a moment. You don't have to decide anything today. I know. She looked at the yard, at the barn, at the snow that was already starting to melt at the edges where the sun had been hitting it all morning. I'm not deciding today, she paused, but I'm deciding. He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he looked back at the tackle in his hands. And if there was something in the line of his shoulders that had shifted slightly, some careful, managed tension that had released by a degree, she noticed it and said nothing about it. That evening, the 11 of them sat around a table that was too small by any practical calculation, and ate a meal that Clara and Harlan had made in the same kitchen at the same time without quite collaborating, which produced results that were better than either would have managed alone. George talked about land surveys. Samuel spilled his water and cleaned it up without being asked, which was a development that made Clara visibly surprised. Ruth described the bay mare's behavior that afternoon in the specific language she was developing for horses, which was already more precise than most adults managed. Lily didn't talk, but she had the harmonica in her pocket. Mara could see the outline of it. After dinner, while the table was being cleared, she took it out and played 3 notes. Just 3, testing something. The table went quiet. She played a few more. She wasn't good yet. She was figuring it out the way she figured everything out carefully, from first principles. But there was something in the 3 notes and the few more that followed that was recognizable as the beginning of a real thing. Caleb, still tired but sitting up, watched her with his chin on his hands. That's pretty, he said. Lily looked at him. I'm still learning. Still pretty, Caleb said. Nobody said anything else about it. The clearing up continued. The evening wound down in the ordinary way of evenings. But Mara noticed, before she went to bed, that Silas had found something else to do in the kitchen long after the dishes were done, and that Lily had been playing quietly for 20 minutes, and that he had stayed without saying a word about it, which was the particular respect of someone who understood that a child finding her way back to something needed to be allowed to do it in peace. Mara went to bed on the 7th night of the week and looked at the ceiling and thought that she had not been saved. She had walked into a storm and found a door that was still open. What happened next was not rescue, it was work, and work she had always known how to do. She closed her eyes. Down the hall, Lily played 3 more notes into the quiet of the house. The paperwork took 3 trips to Harwick. The first trip was administrative. Mara and Silas went together, which felt strange in the particular way that all the ordinary logistics of a situation with no clear precedent felt strange. They weren't married. They weren't formally engaged in the way the settlement office wanted. They were 2 adults who had spent a week together and decided, with the practical honesty that defined both of them, that it was worth continuing. The settlement office wanted a different category. Pemberton shuffled papers and looked at his desk and told them they had 30 days to finalize a formal arrangement or the file would be closed. 30 days, Mara thought. She'd survived 11 months on a failing farm with 9 children and $4.60. 30 days was manageable. The second trip was to the county records office, where Mara needed to file updated address information for the children's records and establish Wyoming residency. That trip she took alone, because it was paperwork and she didn't need company for paperwork, and because she wanted to walk the town of Harwick by herself and take its measure without anyone next to her shaping what she noticed. Harwick was a working town, not large, not prosperous in any dramatic way, but functional and mercantile, a physician's office, a small schoolhouse at the east end of Main Street that she stood outside for a long time looking at. The sign on the door said it operated 4 days a week and had capacity for 30 students. She did the arithmetic in her head. George, Ruth, Lily, Sam, and eventually Caleb. That was 5. 5 children who needed what was behind that door. She would deal with that next, one thing at a time. The third trip to Harwick was the one where she first heard Vernon Crow's name again. She hadn't forgotten him. She'd filed him away. The way she filed things she didn't yet have the resources to address. In a part of her mind that kept a running account, the man who had stood in the settlement office and looked at her youngest child and said the sick one will be dead before spring. She'd filed that too, and the filing hadn't softened it any. She was in the mercantile, picking up supplies with the account Silas had told her to use without ceremony or qualification, just told her, like it was a solved problem when the man behind her in the line said something to the man next to him that used her name. She stilled, the Whitaker woman. Low, conversational, not intended for her. Heard she settled in at Boone's place. Heard the same. 9 children, 9. A pause that carried weight. Vernon said she manipulated Boone into it, that she knew what she was doing when she showed up with that many. Mara kept her face toward the counter. The clerk was tallying her items. She watched his hands move. Vernon's been talking to Alderson at the settlement office. The first man continued. Says there are questions about her late husband's estate. Something that didn't get properly settled. She paid for her supplies. She carried them to the wagon. She sat in the wagon for a moment in the cold, looking at the street, and let the information arrange itself in her mind. Vernon Crow had not simply walked away from the settlement office. He'd decided something. She drove home through the bare winter landscape and thought about what she knew and what she didn't know and what tools she had available, and she did not say anything to Silas that evening because she needed to think before she talked. The problem with Vernon Crow was not that he was powerful, though he was. The problem was that he operated in the register of men who had learned that the most effective pressure was the kind that looked administrative. He didn't threaten people directly. He filed things. He spoke to officials. He created the kind of slow-moving difficulty that wore people down because it never resolved into a single confrontation you could meet head-on. Mara recognized this because she dealt with it in Kansas, with the creditors who had come after Thomas's estate. The difference between a man who came to your door with a demand and a man who worked through official channels was that the second kind was harder to argue with in public. He always had paperwork. She said as much to Silas on the second evening after her return from Harwick. She'd told him what she'd overheard, plainly and without dramatic framing, and watched him take it in. He's been talking to Alderson, Silas said, apparently for some time. Silas was quiet for a moment. He had a way of getting quiet that was not passivity. It was the particular stillness of someone working through something rather than reacting to it. She'd come to recognize the difference. Alderson owes Vernon money, has for 2 years. Mara looked at him. You know this. I know most things about how business works in Carbon County. He said it without pride, just as a fact. Vernon's been buying influence here for 15 years. He doesn't need much, just enough to make things slow down when he wants them slow. What does he want? Silas thought about it. I don't think it's about you specifically. I think it's about the idea of 9 children and a widow establishing themselves on land next to his operation. Vernon doesn't like adjacencies he didn't choose. He paused. He also doesn't like being seen to have lost something. He lost what exactly? He made an offer and you refused it. He doesn't get refused often. Mara thought about the folded paper going back into the coat pocket. The particular way Vernon had delivered the word Rollins. He wasn't offering anything, she said. He was making a purchase. I know that, you know that. Silas looked at her. Vernon doesn't see the distinction. The practical question was what he could actually do. They talked about it carefully, and what emerged was an uncomfortable picture. If there were legitimate questions about the estate debt, questions about whether it had been properly discharged and properly transferred under Kansas law before Mara left the state, then Vernon could tie up the settlement paperwork indefinitely. Not forever, but long enough to exhaust someone, long enough to make staying more difficult than leaving. Is there documentation? Silas asked. From when the debt was settled. There should be, she said. Thomas kept a trunk of papers. I've had it since he died. I haven't gone through all of it. That would be where to start. She nodded. She knew that. She'd been putting off the trunk for reasons she didn't fully want to examine, because going through Thomas's papers meant going through Thomas, and she hadn't entirely finished having feelings about that. And feelings were something she tended to address when she had the time, which she rarely did. But feelings were not the issue right now. Documentation was the issue. "I'll go through the trunk," she said. The trunk was in the back room, pushed under the bed she shared with Clara. It had traveled on the train and in the wagon and through the storm, and it had survived all of that the way certain objects survive things, by being made of something that outlasted weather. It was oak, bound in leather, with a lock that she had the key to on a chain around her neck. She opened it alone in the middle of the afternoon while the younger children were occupied and Clara was helping with the kitchen, and Eli was in the north pasture with Silas and the ranch hands. Thomas's handwriting was in the first stack of papers. She sat with that for a moment, not long, just a moment, because she had known this was coming, and she had decided not to fall apart over it on a practical afternoon, and then she began to read. The financial papers were a particular kind of chaos. Thomas had not been disorganized exactly, but he had operated on a system of arrangement that made sense to him and required decoding for anyone else. He filed things by approximate date rather than category, which meant that a land title could be in the same stack as a letter from a cousin and a receipt for fence supplies. Mara worked through it methodically, which took longer than it should have. She found the creditor release in the fourth stack. It was dated 14 months before Thomas died, a formal letter from the lending institution in Wichita, confirming that the mortgage obligation on the farm property had been satisfied in full under a refinancing agreement with a different institution. She read it twice, then she looked for the second document, the one from the second institution, and found it folded inside a letter Thomas had written to her, and apparently never sent, about how he'd managed to refinance at better terms and was proud of it and wanted to tell her, but hadn't yet found the right moment. She sat holding the letter for longer than she'd sat with anything else in the trunk. Thomas being proud of something he'd done for them and not knowing how to say it. Thomas being Thomas. Then she folded it back up and set it aside and kept looking. The debt that Vernon had apparently identified, the one connected to the estate, was referenced in a court document from the Kansas County Probate Office, dated 3 months after Thomas's death. She read it carefully. It was a notice of claim, not a judgment. Someone had filed a claim against the estate for a debt of $400, which was connected to an equipment loan that Thomas had taken with a cosigner who had since died. She kept looking. The response to that claim was in the next stack. It was a letter from the county probate judge. She recognized the official letterhead. She'd been in that office 5 times during the estate proceedings, confirming that the claim had been reviewed. The cosigning party's estate had been found to hold shared liability, and that the claim against Thomas Whitaker's estate was discharged under the shared liability provision. Discharge full. Dated 8 months ago, she had it. She put everything back in order, made a list of the documents and their dates, and closed the trunk. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and thought about Vernon Crow trying to use a debt that no longer existed to displace a woman and 9 children from a home they'd been in for 3 weeks. She thought about the settlement office clerk, about the man in the mercantile talking low, about the 30-day window and the questions about her late husband's estate. She thought, all right. The ranch continued its own life around the edges of all this. It did not pause for anyone's legal complications, which was both frustrating and steadying. The animals needed feeding, and the fences needed work, and Caleb needed his medicine schedule kept to the day. And those facts provided a structure that kept everything else from becoming completely consuming. Caleb was recovering with the reliable stubbornness of a 3-year-old who didn't understand he was supposed to find illness an interesting experience. He pushed his limits daily. Mara pushed them back. They had a running negotiation about what counted as well enough to go outside, and Caleb was creative about his arguments, as in the way small children were creative about arguments' absolute logic applied to entirely wrong premises. "I feel warm," he announced on the 9th day at the ranch. "That means better. Warm is the fever," Mara said. "That's the opposite of better." Caleb considered this with the focused frown of someone finding a flaw in a theory. "Ruth feels warm, too. Ruth is not sick. How do you know?" "Because she's been in the barn since 6 this morning." Caleb accepted this as conclusive evidence. "Can I go to the barn?" "No." "When can I go to the barn?" "When Dr. Hale says." "When is Dr. Hale coming?" "Thursday." Caleb looked at the ceiling. "What day is today?" "Tuesday." He was quiet for a moment, working through whether Tuesday to Thursday was negotiable. He arrived at the conclusion that it wasn't and redirected. "Can Ruth come in and tell me about the horses?" Ruth appeared in the doorway, as if she'd been listening from the hall, which she had been. "The bay mare let me put a bridle on her this morning," she said, and sat down on the edge of his bed and began describing it in the precise, unhurried language she used for horses, and Caleb listened with his hands folded under his chin like someone at a story hour. Mara left them to it and went to find Silas. She showed him the documents that evening after dinner, when the house was in its after-dinner state of various people doing various things in various corners. She spread them on the kitchen table in order: creditor release, refinancing confirmation, probate claim notice, discharge letter, and walked him through them without unnecessary commentary. He read each one. He was a careful reader, which she'd noticed with the ranch documents she'd seen him handle. He didn't skim, he read, and he went back when something needed a second look. When he finished, he sat back. "The discharge is complete," she said. "Yes, Vernon's claiming there's a debt that hasn't been settled, but the court discharged it 8 months ago. There's no legal ground." "No," Silas said, "there isn't." He looked at the discharge letter. "The question is whether Alderson at the settlement office knows that, or whether Vernon let him know it and he decided not to care. If he knows and is choosing to ignore it, that's a different kind of problem." "It is." Silas tapped the table once. "We need to take these to Harwick." "Not to Alderson. To the county clerk's office. File them as official documentation of the estate settlement, and that protects us legally. It creates a public record that Vernon can't quietly make disappear." He looked at her. "He can still make noise. He can still go around talking to people. But he won't have an official claim to point at." Mara looked at the papers. "He won't stop." "No, he won't." Silas said it without sugarcoating it. "Vernon stops when he decides the cost is higher than the benefit. Right now he thinks this is easy. We need to make it less easy." "Yes." She thought about that for a moment. There was something else she'd been thinking about, something separate from the documentation, that she hadn't yet said out loud. She looked at Silas and said it. "I want to talk to him." Silas looked at her steadily. "To Vernon." "Yes." A pause. "Why?" "Because he's been talking about us to other people. To the mercantile man, to Alderson, probably to others I haven't heard about yet. And none of those conversations include us. He gets to frame what we are without any contradiction." She looked at the table. "I don't want our story told by the man who wanted to send my children to a county home." Silas was quiet for a long moment. She watched him think about it, not talking her out of it, just thinking about it. "Not alone," he said. "I wasn't planning on going alone." He nodded. "We file the papers first. Can we talk?" They filed the papers on a Wednesday, which was the coldest day of the second week at the ranch. The county clerk's office was staffed by a woman named Mrs. Portwood, who had the efficient neutrality of someone who had handled enough frontier complications to stop finding them remarkable. She examined the documents, verified the dates, and stamped them into the record without editorializing. "That's your copy," she said, sliding a receipt across the counter to Mara. "Filed as of today." "Thank you," Mara said, as they were leaving. Mrs. Portwood said, not looking up from her next task, "Mr. Crow was in here last week, asking about the Whitaker estate file." Mara stopped. "What did you tell him?" "That estate records are public document." She looked up then, briefly. "So is this." She went back to her work. Mara and Silas walked out into the cold. "She told him," Silas said. "She told us that he was asking," Mara said. "I think that's information she wanted us to have." Silas considered that. "Mrs. Portwood has been the county clerk for 20 years. She's watched Vernon operate for most of them. Apparently she has opinions. Apparently she does." He drove back to the ranch with the receipt in Mara's coat pocket, and the knowledge that Vernon Crow now knew, or would soon know, that the documentation he'd been counting on not existing actually existed. What he did with that information would tell them something about his next move. They didn't have to wait long. The rumor arrived, the way rumors arrived in small frontier communities, not as a single statement but as a fog. It didn't have a source you could point at. It existed in the spaces between things people said, in the pauses, in the way certain conversations stopped when Mara walked into the mercantile the following Friday. The shape of the rumor, as she was eventually able to piece it together from what Clara overheard at the dry goods counter and what Harlan heard from a supply driver, was this. Mara Whitaker had arrived at the Harwick settlement office, specifically because she'd heard Silas Boone was the wealthiest unmarried rancher in Carbon County. She had come prepared. The 9 children were leverage. The presentation of helplessness was calculated. The storm was convenient timing. She had known exactly what she was doing. It was the kind of rumor that was impossible to disprove directly, because it attributed motive, and motive lives inside a person where no one else can see it. You could prove the debt was settled. You couldn't prove what you'd been thinking when you boarded a train. Clara told Mara about it with the directness she brought to difficult information. She sat across the kitchen table and said, "People are saying you planned it." Mara looked at her oldest daughter. Clara was 16 and had been managing difficult information since she was 14, and she delivered this particular piece of it with no visible emotion, which Mara knew meant she was feeling more than she was showing. "Yes," Mara said, "I know. Is Silas worried?" "You could ask him." "I'm asking you." Mara thought about what she knew of Silas 8 days of watching him, which was not a long time and also, given the circumstances, was enough. "No," she said. He's not worried about what people say happened. He was there. Clara nodded slowly. Eli is angry. I know that too. Clara paused, choosing her framing. He wants to respond. I'll talk to him. She found Eli in the barn, which had become his second home the way the study had become George's. He was cleaning a saddle with the focused aggression of someone using physical work to contain something. He heard her come in and didn't stop what he was doing. I heard, he said. I know, it's a lie, it is. Then why? He stopped. Set down the cloth. Why do we just have to let him say it? Mara sat on a nearby crate. She looked at her son, this 14-year-old boy, who had his father's jaw and her own stubbornness and the particular coiled anger of someone who had been watching adults fail at things for long enough to have lost patience with the process. We're not going to let him say it indefinitely, she said. We're going to do something about it. What? We're going to make sure it can't stick. She looked at him directly. A lie has to have space to live in. It lives in the spaces where people don't know the truth yet. We fill those spaces. Eli looked at her for a moment, working it out. By talking to people. By being here. By being visible. By letting people see who we actually are and what we're actually doing. She paused. Vernon Crow wants people to see us as a problem. We need to be where people can see that we're not. Eli picked up the cloth again. He was quiet for a moment. Can I come to Harwick when you go? Yes. To the part where you talk to Crow? She looked at him. He met her eyes steadily, which was new. 6 weeks ago he wouldn't have held that look. To the part where we do things in town, she said. Not to the part where I talk to Vernon. That's between adults. He didn't like that answer, but he accepted it, which was itself a development. He went back to the saddle, Eli. She stood up. You're allowed to be angry. I'm angry. But don't let him make you into something you're not going to want to be later. He looked at the saddle. What does that mean? It means anger is useful if it makes you sharper. It's not useful if it makes you stupid. He was quiet for a moment. Then in a slightly different register, quieter, less armored. Do you think Silas is going to stay through all of this? Mara considered the question honestly. I think he's not the kind of man who leaves when things get complicated, she said. But I've only known him 3 weeks. I can't promise you more than what I've seen. Eli nodded. That was apparently sufficient, not reassurance, just honest information, which was what he'd always responded to better than comfort. She went back to the house. The encounter with Vernon Crow happened 10 days later, on a Thursday, and it did not happen the way Mara had planned it. She had to seek him out, had discussed with Silas the logistics of approaching Vernon's ranch, or intercepting him in town and having the conversation directly. But Vernon came to them first, which told her something about how confident he was, or how much he thought they still didn't know. He arrived at the ranch on a Thursday morning with one of his men beside him, and the bearing of someone paying a business call. He did not send word ahead. He rode into the yard as if the question of whether he was welcome had already been answered in his favor. Harlan saw him first from the barn and came to find Silas, who was in the workshop with Henry. Mara was in the kitchen. By the time she came to the door, Silas was already in the yard, and Vernon had dismounted, and they were looking at each other with the particular quality of two men who have known each other long enough to have decided things. Mara came down the porch steps. Vernon's eyes moved to her. He had the expression of a man recalibrating. He had expected to deal with Silas, and Mara's arrival required him to adjust his opening position. He did it smoothly, which told her he was good at this. Mrs. Whitaker, he said. I heard you'd gotten settled. Mr. Crow, she said. He looked at the house, the barn, the yard, with its evidence of occupation boots lined up by the door. Ruth's rope coiled on the fence post, the general texture of a house where many people lived. Quite an operation, he said. It wasn't a compliment. We're managing, Mara said. I've been hearing about the paperwork situation, he said, shifting smoothly to what he'd come about. Some questions about the estate documentation. There were questions, Mara said. We answered them. A pause. I heard there was some confusion about an outstanding debt. There was no outstanding debt. There is documentation to that effect, filed with the county clerk's office as of Wednesday of last week. She said it plainly, no heat in it, just information. If you'd like to review it, Mrs. Portwood can help you. Something moved in Vernon's face, not much, but something. That's thorough, he said. I try to be. He looked at Silas. Silas, you've got a good operation here. 15 years of solid work. He said it in the tone of a man establishing a baseline before making a different point. Adding this kind of complexity. I didn't ask your assessment of my operation, Silas said. His voice had not changed. It had the same quality it always had, level, no performance in it, or my decisions. Vernon looked at him for a long moment. The morning was cold and clear, and the two men stood in it with about 8 feet between them and the particular stillness of a conversation that had gotten to its actual subject. I made an offer, Vernon said, at the settlement office. A reasonable offer. You asked her to give up 2 of her children, Silas said. I offered a practical solution to a difficult situation. You looked at a sick 3-year-old and told his mother he'd be dead by spring. Silas said it the same way he said everything directly, without ornament. That's not a practical solution. That's a threat dressed up like advice. Vernon shifted his weight. His man had not dismounted, which Mara had been keeping track of. The boy is sick, he said. That's a medical fact. Caleb had pneumonia, Mara said. He's recovering. She looked at Vernon. My children are not problems to be redistributed. They're not assets to be split. They're my family, and this ranch is where we live. That's settled. Vernon looked at her for a long time. He had the expression of a man who was determining whether the next move he'd planned was still viable, which told her he'd had a next move planned. He looked around the yard once more, that inventory look, and then back at her. Quite a woman, he said, not warmly, like he was filing an observation. Just a mother, she said. He remounted. His man turned the horse already. The territory has long memories, Mrs. Whitaker. So do I, she said. He rode out of the yard at the same pace he'd ridden in. Mara watched him go and didn't move until he was out of sight. Silas stood beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. He'll try something else, she said. Yes, he agreed. That wasn't the end of it. No. But he knows now that the documentation exists and that we're not going to pretend we don't know what he's been doing. He paused. That changes his calculation. Mara turned back toward the house. In the doorway, just barely visible, was Eli. He hadn't been there the whole time. He'd appeared at some point, and he'd watched the end of the exchange without anyone telling him to leave. He looked at his mother coming up the steps with the expression of someone who has just watched something important and is revising his understanding of something. She walked past him into the house without saying anything. Behind her, she heard Eli say to Silas in a low voice that was trying to be casual. She didn't flinch. And Silas, equally low, no, she didn't. Mara kept walking. In the kitchen, she put the kettle on. Her hands were steady. She had long practice at keeping her hands steady after difficult conversations. It was something she'd developed in the years of managing Thomas's business troubles. All those meetings with creditors and lawyers and people who thought that because she was a woman, she hadn't fully understood what was being said to her. She had always understood. The kettle began to heat. Kitchen smelled like wood smoke and the remnants of breakfast, and faintly, from down the hall like the horse blanket Ruth had brought inside and been told 3 times to put back in the barn. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway with the harmonica. She'd been getting better. Not good yet, she'd been playing for less than 2 weeks, but better in the way of someone who practices because they want to, not because they've been told to. She looked at Mara with that watchful, measuring look she always had. Are we okay, Lily asked. Mara looked at her daughter, 6 years old, and the question was, are we okay? Not what happened. Not who was that man. But the essential question, the one that actually mattered. We're okay, Mara said. Lily looked at her for a moment longer, deciding whether to accept this. Then she nodded and went back down the hall. A minute later, 3 notes floated out from the direction of the study. Mara poured her coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard where Vernon Crow's horse prints were already being softened by a thin crust of new ice forming on the snow. Outside in the north pasture, she could just make out the shape of Ruth at the fence line, and beside her, closer than he'd stood to anything, in weeks, the silhouette of Eli watching whatever Ruth was showing him in the way of horses. The afternoon would come with its work, its small negotiations, its ordinary and non-ordinary demands. Caleb's medicine at 2, the east fence Silas had mentioned, needing attention. The letter Mara needed to write to the county school, to ask about enrollment for 5. The days had started to accumulate in the particular way of days that were building something. She drank her coffee and let them. The letter from the settlement office arrived on a Monday, 3.5 weeks after Mara had filed the estate documentation with Mrs. Portwood. She recognized Alderson's handwriting on the envelope. Before she opened it, she'd seen it on the original correspondence, the careful loops of a man who had learned penmanship as a point of professional pride. She opened it at the kitchen table while the breakfast dishes were still being cleared, which was not the ideal circumstance for reading official correspondence, but was the reality of a house with 9 children and a morning schedule that did not pause. The letter was 4 paragraphs. The first 2 were administrative preamble, the kind of official language that existed to make a simple thing sound complicated. The third paragraph was the substance. The settlement office had received information suggesting that the estate of Thomas Whitaker carried unresolved financial obligations that may affect the standing of the applicant under the frontier settlement provisions of Wyoming territorial law. Pending review, the 30-day window for formalization of the arrangement was being extended to allow for investigation. The 4th paragraph wished her well and was signed by Alderson. Mara read it twice. Then she set it down and drank the rest of her coffee, which had gone cold. Clara, who had been watching from the other side of the table, said bad. Inconvenient, Mara said, which was different from bad, and she needed to keep that distinction clear in her own head. She showed it to Silas that evening. He read it with the same careful attention he brought to anything written and set it down on the table between them. He filed something, Silas said. Through Alderson, yes, after you filed the discharge documentation, which he knows exists. She looked at the letter. He's not trying to win this on the merits. He's trying to make it last long enough that we give up. Silas was quiet for a moment. Alderson doesn't have the authority to void a settlement arrangement on his own. He can slow things down. He can request documentation he already has. He can create correspondence. He tapped the table. But there's a territorial commissioner who oversees settlement disputes. If this goes to a formal review, Alderson loses control of the timeline. Mara looked at him. You know this. I had a dispute with a neighboring claim 8 years ago. Went to formal review. It takes longer, but the outcome is harder to manipulate. He met her eyes. Vernon knows this too, which is why he wants to keep it at Alderson's level. So we request the formal review ourselves. Yes, she thought about it. A formal review meant more time, more uncertainty, more paperwork traveling in more directions. It also meant taking the thing out of Vernon Crow's preferred territory, which was the quiet administrative space where he could apply pressure without anyone watching too carefully. How long does a formal review take? 2 months. Sometimes 3. She thought about 2 or 3 months of this. She thought about the children, who had been at the ranch for 4 weeks now and had stopped, most of them, bracing for the next displacement, who had started to inhabit the place the way people inhabit a home, rather than a temporary shelter. Caleb had finally been allowed to visit the barn last week, and had spent 40 minutes discussing the horses with Ruth in the particular serious manner of a 3-year-old making up for lost time. She thought about what 2 or 3 more months of uncertainty would do to that. File for the formal review, she said. The weeks that followed had the quality of a slow-moving storm. You could see it coming, could see the pressure building, but the actual breaking of it was still somewhere ahead. Life on the ranch continued with its rhythms, because the ranch did not care about legal correspondence, and the animals required feeding on a schedule that took no account of territorial commissioners. The children had started at the Harwick School, which had involved a complicated first week of logistics. The wagon ride was 40 minutes each way, which meant an early start and a late return, and Mara had negotiated with Silas about who could manage the driving on the days when ranch work demanded otherwise. They had arrived at an arrangement that involved Harlan on 2 days, and one of the ranch hands on the others, and Silas on Fridays, which was the day he usually went into town for supplies anyway. George had been placed 2 grades ahead of his age, which had produced a complicated set of reactions in him: pride, anxiety, and the specific social discomfort of a 10-year-old among 12-year-olds who had not yet decided whether he was interesting or annoying. Ruth had immediately found the 2 other children in the school, who cared about animals and established working relationships with both of them. Lily had not spoken to anyone for the first 3 days, and then, on the 4th day, had apparently demonstrated something on the school's battered upright piano that had resulted in the teacher asking Mara, during a pickup, whether Lily had formal training. None, Mara had said. The teacher had looked thoughtful. She might want some. Samuel had punched a boy on the 2nd day and had to be spoken to seriously about it, which resulted in a negotiation that established the terms under which punching was not acceptable and why. A conversation that Samuel engaged with the philosophical seriousness he brought to everything once he understood it was being taken seriously. He had not punched anyone since, though Mara retained moderate skepticism about the durability of this. Caleb was not yet well enough for school. He stayed at the ranch with Mara, and increasingly with Harlan, who had developed an arrangement with the child that neither of them seemed to feel the need to explain. Caleb followed Harlan on his morning rounds. Harlan narrated what he was doing in the same flat, factual tone he used for everything. Caleb asked questions, Harlan answered them. It was not warm, exactly, but it was consistent, and Caleb, who had spent most of his short life being the youngest, and therefore the most managed, responded to being treated as someone capable of receiving information. Mara had observed this without comment. She had learned in 4 weeks on this ranch that some things were better observed than discussed. The piece of information that changed the shape of everything came from an unexpected direction. It came from May. May Whitaker was 11 years old and had the particular mental quality of someone who processed numbers not as symbols but as stories, patterns that had meaning, relationships that suggested other relationships. She had been doing the ranch accounts with Harlan for 2 weeks, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she had noticed a discrepancy in the February tallies and had corrected it, and Harlan, after verifying her correction, had started leaving the ledger where she could reach it. She came to Mara on a Thursday evening with the ledger and a piece of paper she'd been working on separately, covered in her small, precise handwriting. I found something, she said. Mara looked at what she'd brought. The paper was a set of numbers organized in columns with dates running down the left side. Mara could read a ledger Thomas had taught her, because she'd seen early what happened to women who didn't know where the money was, but May's notation system was its own dialect, faster and denser than the standard form. Show me what I'm looking at, Mara said. May sat down and pointed. These are the Crow Ranch supply orders, from the Harwick Mercantile. She indicated the leftmost column. Mr. Fenwick keeps his ledger open on the counter when he's doing tallies. I saw it last Tuesday when we were waiting for the school supplies. You read his ledger from across the counter. May looked at her without apology. The columns were visible. Mara decided not to address the ethics of this right now. Go on. Vernon Crow has been buying fence materials, feed and equipment in quantities that don't match his declared land use. May pointed to a figure. He declared 300 head of cattle to the county assessor. But the feed quantities he's been ordering since October suggest closer to 500, possibly more. Mara looked at the numbers. She was not an accountant, but she understood the shape of what May was showing her. He's underreporting. To the county assessor, yes, which means he's underpaying his grazing fees. May's voice had the specific flatness of someone reporting a mathematical fact, entirely separate from its implications. The difference over 12 months would be significant. Saw sat with that for a moment. She thought about Vernon Crow in the settlement office, precise and authoritative, a man who managed his territory with careful attention to the mechanisms of official accounting. She thought about him filing complaints through Alderson, using the administrative system with the confidence of someone who believed that system was reliably on his side. She thought about what it meant that it might not be as reliably on his side as he assumed. You didn't tell anyone else this, Mara asked. I told you first. Good. Mara looked at the paper. Leave this with me. May closed the ledger and stood up with the brisk efficiency of someone whose job is done. Then she paused. Mara, yes? You tried to send Caleb away. May said it with no particular emotion, just establishing a fact the way she always did. I don't forget things like that. She left. Mara sat at the table with the paper in her hand and thought about her 11-year-old daughter reading a mercantile ledger from across a counter and doing the arithmetic to find something that Vernon Crow had been counting on no one finding. She told Silas about it that night. He read May's figures twice. He knew the county's declared grazing rates, and he did the math in his head. Mara could see him doing it, and when he finished, he set the paper down, with an expression that was not quite satisfaction, but was in that direction. This is a county assessor matter, he said. Not a settlement office matter. Different officials. Different officials entirely. Vernon has no particular influence with the county assessor. That's Peterson's office, and Peterson and Vernon have never had a comfortable relationship. He looked at the figures again. If this gets to Peterson, it becomes a legal obligation problem for Vernon at the exact moment he's trying to apply pressure through Alderson. He'd be on defense, Mara said, considerably on defense. She thought about it. I don't want to use this as a weapon. I want to use it as a wall. Silas looked at her. Explain the difference. A weapon is something you point at someone. A wall is something you build so they can't get through. She looked at the numbers. If we take this to Peterson quietly, not making a production of it, not announcing publicly that we found it, it creates a problem for Vernon that occupies him. He can't be aggressively pursuing us through Alderson if he's simultaneously managing an assessor inquiry. Silas considered this. Peterson will investigate regardless once he has the information. Vernon will know the information came from somewhere. He'll suspect. He won't know. He'll suspect us. He already doesn't like us, Mara said. That's not a new condition. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then you've been thinking about this for a while. Since May showed me the numbers. Yes. He looked at her with the expression she'd learned to read as genuine assessment, not agreeing automatically, not pushing back reflexively, just actually looking at what she'd said and measuring it. It's the right move, he said. It's also the move Vernon won't expect, because it doesn't come directly from the settlement dispute. It comes from a different direction. Men who are used to controlling one game rarely watch the second board, Mara said. Silas looked at her. Where'd you get that, my father? She paused. He was a terrible farmer and an excellent chess player. He said it described most of the men he'd ever lost money to. Something moved in Silas's expression, not quite a smile, but the place where a smile would have been if he'd been someone who smiled more easily. I'll go to Peterson's office Thursday. I'll come with you. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. He nodded. That was that. Peterson's office was not in the main municipal building, but in a smaller 1-2 streets off Main, which said something about how the county prioritized its functions. The assessor himself was a compact, precise man in his mid-60s who had the expression of someone who had been watching the county's landowners misreport their holdings for so long that very little surprised him. He looked at May's figures for a long time without speaking. This is a miner's observation of a mercantile ledger, he said finally. It is, Silas said. You'll want to verify it against this official supply records. I will, Peterson set the paper down. He looked at Silas. You understand this will take time to investigate properly. We understand. And that during that time, I can't discuss the investigation status with anyone. We're not asking you to discuss it, Mara said. We're asking you to look at whether the numbers are accurate. Peterson looked at her. He had the particular quality of a man who spent his days with figures and had developed a corresponding respect for people who were also comfortable with figures. Where did the child learn to read supply ledgers like this? She's always been like that, Mara said. We stopped questioning it. He almost smiled. I'll be in touch, he said, through official channels. They left on the street outside, Silas said. That went well. He was already suspicious of something, Mara said. You could see it. We just gave him a direction to look. Vernon's been doing this for years, probably. Peterson's a careful man. If he didn't know exactly, he had a sense. They walked back to the wagon. The March air had the particular quality of Wyoming early spring cold still, but with a different quality to it, like the temperature had changed its mind about something. What happened in Harwick over the following 2 weeks was the kind of thing that didn't announce itself loudly. There was no single confrontation, no public breaking point. It was more like a shift in atmospheric pressure, gradual, hard to point to, but unmistakable once you'd been there long enough to feel the difference. The mercantile was the first place Mara noticed it. Fenwick, who had been careful and neutral in his manner during her first visits, not rude, not warm, calibrated, began to talk to her. About the weather, about the school, about his own family situation. The way people talk when they've decided you're someone worth the small investment of ordinary conversation. It was not a large shift. It was the shift of being included in the category of people who belonged rather than people who were being evaluated. The woman at the dry goods counter, whose name was Agnes Calhoun, stopped being careful. She'd been careful in the way people were careful around situations they hadn't decided about yet. Then one afternoon, she asked Mara directly about Caleb, because she'd heard there'd been a sick child, and Mara told her plainly what had happened: the pneumonia, the doctor, the recovery. And Agnes Calhoun said, "He rode through that blizzard himself?" And when Mara said yes, Agnes said, well, in the tone of someone updating a significant file. The school teacher, a woman named Miss Aldrich, stopped Mara at pickup one Friday to talk about George. Not the 2 grades ahead placement, which was old news, but about a paper George had written about Wyoming land survey law that Miss Aldrich had apparently found remarkable enough to share with the county superintendent. He's 10, Miss Aldrich said, with the expression of someone who kept needing to remind herself of this. Yes, Mara said. He should have access to more books than our school library has. He's working through Silas's collection. He'll need more than that eventually.
I know, Mara looked at her. We're working on a permanent arrangement.
Once things are settled. Miss Aldrich looked at her with the direct assessing quality of a woman who had been watching children and families long enough to read situations accurately. Settle them, she said, in the tone of someone who was expressing support without being sentimental about it. Mara went home that afternoon with the particular feeling of a woman who has been fighting in the dark and has just noticed that the light has shifted. The formal review request had gone in, and the commissioner's office had responded with an acknowledgement and a timeline 8 weeks minimum for a full review, which put the resolution sometime in late May. 2 months of official uncertainty during which the settlement arrangement remained technically provisional. Silas had called it provisional. Mara had said that provisional was a word for paperwork, and paperwork was not what they were building. They were in the kitchen when she said it. Harlan was outside. The children were in various corners of the house and yard. It was an ordinary Wednesday evening, and the remark had come out of a conversation about the formal review timeline, and after she said it, she realized it was the clearest thing she'd said about the situation since she'd answered his question on the first night. Silas looked at her for a moment. No, he said, it's not. They hadn't talked directly about the question the settlement office was formally asking. There had been no formal conversation in which they had established terms, no negotiation, no arrangement-making in the transactional sense. They had been living alongside each other for 6 weeks in a condition that was both perfectly clear and entirely unspoken, which was its own kind of conversation, one that Mara had found more trustworthy than the formal kind. But provisional was a word for paperwork, and eventually the paperwork needed an answer, and she had been thinking about that answer. I want to ask you something, she said. He waited. If the formal review comes back and the arrangement is finalized, you understand what that means for the rest of it. Not just the legal question, the actual living of it. 9 children, he said, 9 children, possibly some of them for a very long time. George will leave eventually, probably for school. Clara will. She stopped, because she didn't know exactly what Clara would do. only that Clara was 16 and capable of almost anything and would make her own decisions about it. The point is that this is not a temporary complexity. This is the permanent shape of the situation. I know the shape, he said. I want to make sure you've sat with it. Not the idea of it, the actual. Mara, he said her name without impatience, just to stop the forward motion of what she was doing. I rode into a blizzard for Caleb. I've been watching Eli work the east fence for 3 weeks. I read George's land survey paper before Miss Aldrich saw it, a pause. I know the shape. She looked at him. She thought about the first night, the wagon in the blizzard, the question he'd asked before all the others. She thought about the names, all 9, in order, without notes. All right, she said. All right, what? All right, yes. She looked at the table for a moment, and then back at him. When the review is done, he was quiet for a moment. Not stunned, that wasn't the right word. More like a man who has been waiting for something and has now received it, and is taking a moment to let it be real. Okay, he said. Not because I need rescuing, I know that. Because this is where we should be. Yes, he said. That was the extent of it. No ceremony, no declarations beyond the ones that mattered. Outside, Lily was playing something on the harmonica that had graduated from 3 notes to something that was almost recognizable as a melody. Inside, Harlan had come back from the barn and was moving around in the back of the house with the deliberate discretion of a man who understood that certain conversations deserved their space. The crisis, when it came, arrived in a form Mara hadn't anticipated, which she later thought she should have, because Vernon Crow had always been most dangerous when he'd been cornered. The Peterson inquiry had apparently reached him. She didn't know exactly when or through what channel Vernon had enough connections in the county administrative structure that news traveled to him quickly. What she knew was that on the 3rd week of March, Alderson at the settlement office received an amended complaint. This one did not concern the estate debt. It concerned the children directly. The complaint claimed that the welfare of the minor children was uncertain, given the provisional and unformalized nature of the arrangement, and requested that the county welfare office conduct a review of the children's living situation and educational arrangements. Clara brought the letter in from the mailbox. She read it. Mara had taught all of them to read official correspondence, because you couldn't respond to what you didn't understand, and she came to find Mara in the yard, with the letter held flat in both hands, and an expression that Mara had not seen on her daughter's face in a long time. It was fear. Controlled, managed, held behind Clara's particular capable stillness, but fear. He's trying to take us, Clara said. Her voice was level. The words underneath it weren't. Mara took the letter. Read it. Felt the specific cold of a mother who has just seen the thing she most feared arrive in an envelope. She had spent 11 months protecting these children from systems and people who wanted to separate, evaluate, categorize, manage, or reduce them to a set of problems to be solved. She had stood in the settlement office and said no to 5 men, one after another. She had ridden through paperwork and rumors and a blizzard's worth of unofficial pressure. She had filed documents and spoken to officials and stood in Vernon Crow's riding path without moving. And he had found this, because this was the thing she could not argue with on the merits, not quickly. A welfare review took time. A welfare review could recommend interventions. A welfare review operated on its own timeline, independent of the settlement formalization, independent of the Peterson inquiry, independent of everything she'd built as a counterweight. She read the letter twice. Then she looked at Clara. Go get Silas, she said. Clara went. Mara stood in the yard with the letter and made herself breathe steadily, because the next thing she did needed to come from the part of her brain that was still thinking rather than the part that was reacting. She had learned this skill slowly, and at some cost, and she deployed it now. The letter requested a review. A review required a reviewer. A reviewer would need to observe the living situation, the educational arrangements, the physical welfare of the children. And when that reviewer arrived, they would find 9 children in a working ranch, 4 of them actively in school, 1 of them recovering from a documented illness under a physician's ongoing care, all of them fed and housed and occupied, and here was the thing Vernon had miscalculated, visibly, demonstrably thriving. He had handed them a formal process, and formal processes, Mara had learned, went in the direction the evidence pointed. Silas arrived from the barn. He read the letter with his usual thoroughness and set it down. He's scared, he said. Mara looked at him. What? This is a desperate move. He's been outmaneuvered on the debt question. He's got Peterson looking at his grazing records, and now he's throwing everything he has left. Silas looked at the letter. A welfare complaint about children who are fed, schooled, and housed. He knows it won't hold. He wants to run the clock. It could still disrupt.
It could.
But look at what he's asking anyone to believe. He looked at her directly. That the woman who refused to leave one child behind is neglecting her children. In front of Miss Aldrich, who knows George. In front of Agnes Calhoun. In front of Dr. Hale, who treated Caleb. He paused. In front of Harlan, who has opinions about this family whether he says so or not. Mara heard the truth in that. She also heard something else, the way Silas had listed those names without hesitation. The way he'd cataloged the network of witnesses who had been accumulating without anyone planning it, just by the ordinary act of living in a community over 6 weeks. We need to go to Harwick, she said. Yes, not just to file something. I want to talk to people. She looked at the letter. He's been framing our story for months. I want to tell it myself. Silas looked at her for a moment. All of it, what the settlement office was, what those 6 men said, what Vernon said about Caleb. She held his eyes. People in this town think they know what happened because Vernon told them. They should hear it from me. He was quiet. He was thinking about it, not reflexively agreeing, which she'd come to appreciate. It's a risk, he said. Public. Everything's been public. He made it public. I'm just going to be present for the conversation instead of absent from it. He nodded once. When's Saturday, when the most people are in town? Saturday in Harwick had a particular texture, the mercantile busy, the street active, people moving between errands with the slightly compressed efficiency of frontier residents who made their town trips count. Mara knew this because she'd observed it on her own trips. She'd been cataloging the rhythms of the place the way she'd cataloged everything carefully, without announcing that she was doing it. She went with Silas, and she went with Eli, and she went with Clara, because she'd decided that the children who were old enough to choose to be present should have the choice. The younger ones stayed at the ranch with Harlan, who had been told what was happening, and had responded with the verbal minimalism he used for everything significant. Didn't make a speech. That wasn't what Mara had in mind. What she had in mind was simpler and harder, just being present, talking to people, letting the conversation go where it went, and not controlling it beyond saying true things clearly. She talked to Agnes Calhoun first, because Agnes had always been direct and would receive directness in return. She told her about the welfare complaint. Agnes's expression went through several stages before settling into something that was primarily indignant. He filed a welfare complaint, Agnes said. Yes, about those children. Agnes had met Caleb twice, had given Samuel a piece of hard candy during the school pickup confusion of the first week, and had had the piano conversation about Lily with Mara 2 weeks earlier. About your children? Yes. Agnes looked toward the window of the mercantile, which faced the street, and then back at Mara with the expression of a woman who had made a decision. Does Miss Aldrich know? Not yet. She will by noon. The conversation with Fenwick went differently. He was more cautious, more attentive to the political shape of things, but he listened and he asked questions, and the questions were the right ones, the ones of a man trying to establish facts rather than protect a position. When Mara told him what Vernon had said in the settlement office about Caleb, the specific words, "The sick one will be dead before spring," Fenwick's face changed in the way of someone hearing something that crystallizes a picture they'd been trying to see. He said that, Fenwick said, not a question. In a room with 9 children present, Mara said. Yes. Fenwick looked at the counter. He was thinking about something. He's been a customer here for 20 years, he said. Not to her specifically. I know. He ran a tab for 4 months without settling it 2 years ago. He said this like he was updating a ledger entry. I carried it because of who he was. Mara said nothing. The boy is better? Fenwick asked. Caleb's better. Nearly well enough for school. Fenwick nodded. He went back to his work. But his manner for the rest of the morning had shifted in the specific way of a man who has revised a calculation. The moment that mattered most happened not in a store but on the street, and it happened because of Eli. Eli had been moving through the morning's activity with the contained intensity he brought to things he considered important. He'd been present at the Calhoun conversation, had listened without speaking, which for Eli was evidence of genuine self-control. He'd waited outside the mercantile. He'd walked the street with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the buildings. Vernon Crow arrived at 11. He came down the street from the direction of the stockyard alone this time, and he saw Silas first, and then Mara, and then Eli, and his face did the recalibration it had done at the ranch yard, the adjustment of a man who had planned for one situations and arrived at another. He stopped. The street had maybe a dozen people on it. It was not a crowd, but it was witnesses. Mara walked toward him. She had thought about what she was going to say, and then she had decided to not plan it, because planned things sounded planned, and this needed to sound like what it was. Mr. Crow, she said. He looked at her. He had his authority assembled around him the way he always did, that air of settled certainty. Mrs. Whitaker, you filed a welfare complaint about my children. He said nothing for a moment. Around them, the street had acquired the particular attention of people who are trying to look like they're not listening. The settlement situation raises questions, he said. I was acting in the children's interest. You told me in that office that my youngest son would be dead before spring, she said. You told me to send my 3-year-old to a county home. That was your interest in my children." Her voice was level. She was not shouting. She didn't need to. "Don't stand in the street of this town and tell me you're acting for them." Vernon looked at her. He had the face of a man running calculations. "You've been managing this county for a long time," she said. "I understand that. I'm not asking you to apologize for what you are. But we are here. We are staying. My children are in school, and they are fed, and they are cared for. And any official who comes to review that situation will see it clearly." She paused. "We're not going anywhere, Mr. Crow. And I'd rather we manage to exist in the same territory without whatever this has been. But that choice is yours to make." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned and walked back to where Silas was standing. Eli fell into step beside her. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. But she felt him beside her, solid, present, moving in the same direction, and thought that whatever she'd hoped to show him about what anger was good for, maybe she'd shown it today. Behind them she heard nothing from Vernon Crow, which was, she thought, a kind of answer. The ride home was quiet for the first few miles. Clara sat in the back with her thoughts. Eli watched the road. Silas drove. After a while, Silas said, "Peterson's office sent a notice to my land address yesterday. The assessor's inquiry into the Crow grazing records is now formal." Mara looked ahead at the road. "When did you find out?" "Yesterday morning." "You didn't tell me. You had enough to manage yesterday." He paused. "I'm telling you now." She thought about that. About a man who timed information not for his own convenience, but for when she could use it. She thought it was a small thing, and also not small at all. "Will he fight it?" she asked. "He'll have to settle the difference. It won't bankrupt him. But it'll cost him, and it'll be public record." Silas kept his eyes on the road. He doesn't like public records he didn't write. Mara looked at the horizon, where the ranch would eventually appear out of the flat distance. The sky was something complex clouds moving fast from the northwest, light coming through in long angles that made the snow on the ground look like it was lit from underneath. "When the review comes back," she said. "It will come back the way the evidence points," Silas said. She nodded. She believed that. She'd spent the last months building the evidence, not as strategy exactly, but as the natural result of living honestly in a place and letting people see what that looked like. The evidence was 9 children who were fed, housed, learning, growing, and gradually becoming the kind of people who fixed stoves and read ledgers and calmed difficult horses and played harmonica in the evenings. You could file a complaint about that. You couldn't change what it was. The ranch came into view at the edge of the horizon, and smoke was coming from the kitchen chimney, which meant Harlan had kept the stove going and probably started something for dinner, which he would deny having done intentionally if anyone commented on it. Mara looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked forward at the road that was taking them back. The formal review took 9 weeks instead of 8. The commissioner's representative arrived in the 3rd week of April, a man named Haskell, from the territorial office in Cheyenne, who carried a leather satchel and wore the expression of someone who had reviewed enough frontier settlement disputes to have stopped being surprised by any of them. He spent 2 days at the ranch and 1 day in Harwick, and he interviewed people with the methodical thoroughness of a man who understood that his report would be read carefully by people looking for errors. Mara did not try to manage the process. She had thought about this, had been tempted, because managing things was what she did when she was frightened, and there was a version of herself that would have arranged everything and everyone to optimal presentation. She decided against it for the same reason she'd told Silas on the first morning that she wasn't going to perform. Haskell was looking for the truth of the situation. The truth of the situation was what they actually had. Staging it would only make it look staged. She told the children the same. Answer his questions honestly, don't perform. Samuel asked what perform meant in this context. It means don't try to sound better than you are. Just be what you are. Samuel considered this. What if what I am isn't good enough? Mara looked at her 4-year-old son. Then we'll know that. But I don't think that's what's going to happen. Haskell spoke to George about his schoolwork, and George talked about lands survey law for 20 minutes before Mara gently redirected. He spoke to Ruth about the horses, and Ruth brought him to the barn and showed him the bay mare, who was no longer difficult in any meaningful sense, and who stood quietly while Ruth ran a hand down her neck and explained what she'd been doing for the past 10 weeks in the specific technical language she'd developed for it. Haskell took notes. Mara did not know what kind of notes they were. He spoke to Caleb last, which Mara thought might be deliberate. The child the welfare complaint had implicitly centered, the one Vernon Crow had declared would be dead before spring. Caleb was 4 months past the pneumonia and looked it. He had the color of a child who has been spending time outdoors, which Dr. Hale had approved in early March. He had opinions about horses, about the barn, about the proper procedure for feeding chickens, which Harlan had apparently taught him with the same flat precision he applied to everything. Haskell asked Caleb what he liked about living at the ranch. Caleb thought about it with the seriousness he brought to questions he considered worthy of real answers. Harlan shows me things, he said, and Ruth lets me watch the horses even when she's working. And Silas doesn't make me go inside when I want to stay out unless it's too cold. He paused. Mama decides when it's too cold. Silas agrees with her. Haskell wrote something down. And before Haskell said, in the careful tone of someone asking a child about something without leading them. Before the ranch, do you remember the train? Caleb nodded. I was sick on the train. Were you scared? Caleb looked at the ceiling thinking, Mama wasn't scared, he said. So I wasn't very scared. Mara, who was sitting in the corner of the room and had been told she could stay but not to prompt, looked at the wall and breathed. Haskell's report came back from Cheyenne in the second week of May. Pemberton delivered it personally, which told Mara something about how the office had decided to handle whatever was in it. He came to the ranch in the late afternoon, accepted coffee without being asked, and set the envelope on the kitchen table. The formal review has concluded, he said, with the particular manner of a man who had decided to be professional, about the fact that he'd been used as a tool in something he should have looked at more carefully. The commissioner's office finds no basis for the welfare concerns filed in March. The complaint has been dismissed. He slid the envelope toward Mara. She opened it and read it while he drank his coffee. The language was official and precise. The living situation was found adequate. Educational arrangements were confirmed and active. The medical history of the youngest child was documented, and under appropriate care, no concerns regarding the welfare of the minor children were sustained. The welfare complaint was dismissed in full. The settlement arrangement, pending final formalization, was found to be in compliance with territorial provisions. She set the letter down. Pemberton cleared his throat. There's a secondary matter. The settlement formalization window, the extended review period, has been concluded, and the office is requesting that a final arrangement be submitted within 30 days. We'll be ready, Silas said from the doorway, where he had been since Pemberton arrived. Pemberton looked at them both with the expressions of a man completing an accounting. I should have the earlier process, should have been managed differently. He set it to his coffee cup. Alderson has been reassigned to a different administrative function. Mara looked at him. She thought about the 5 weeks of suspended proceedings, the welfare complaint, the fog of rumor that had required her to walk down a public street and tell the truth to people who hadn't heard it. She thought about Clara's face when she'd brought in that letter, the controlled fear that Clara never should have had to feel. Thank you for bringing this yourself, she said. It was not forgiveness exactly, but it was what she had, and it was honest, and she gave it. Pemberton finished his coffee and left. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Clara, who had heard everything from the hallway, came in and picked up the dismissal letter and read it. Mara watched her read it. Watched the thing in Clara's shoulders that had been held tight for weeks release, very slightly, like a knot that has been worked loose rather than cut. It's done, Clara said. The complaint is done, Mara said. Yes. Clara set the letter down with the careful precision she brought to everything. She'd been 16 when they arrived at the Harwick station, and she was still 16, and she had spent those months carrying a weight that Mara had not been able to take from her, because you cannot take weight from the person who has chosen to carry it. What's next? 30 days, then the formal arrangement. Clara nodded. She went back to whatever she'd been doing. She didn't make a production of the moment. That was Clara. She absorbed things and kept moving. Mara thought, not for the first time, that her eldest daughter would one day be formidable in ways that nobody around her yet fully understood. The Peterson inquiry resolved quietly, the way accounting problems resolved when they were unambiguous. Vernon Crow paid the difference in assessed grazing fees, a sum that was significant but not ruinous, and the public record was updated accordingly. There was no drama to it. The County Gazette ran a small notice in the official filing section that most people skipped, but people talked. The county was not large enough for something like that to remain in the official filing section and nowhere else. Mara heard about it from Agnes Calhoun, who had heard it from Fenwick, who had heard it from someone at the stockyard. The way people talked about it was not with outrage or schadenfreude. Exactly, it was the specific tone of a community updating its understanding of a person it had long taken at face value. Vernon did not disappear from the county. He was still there, still operating his 40,000 acres, still a significant presence in the territory. But significance and influence were not the same thing, and the distinction had become visible. He had spent years building his authority on the confidence that his word would be believed over others. That confidence had a different quality now. Not destroyed, reduced to something more accurately sized. Mara did not feel satisfaction about this precisely. She felt something more complicated, the recognition that the system had imperfectly and slowly, and only after considerable effort, done what systems were supposed to do. That was not nothing. It was also not everything. The children had spent weeks in the shadow of that complaint. Clara had read that letter, that had happened and would not unhappen. The world was not fixed. It had been navigated. There was a difference worth knowing. They married in late May when the land had decided it was spring. It was not a large occasion. Mara had no remaining family in Wyoming, and Silas's people were mostly gone. The attendants were the people who were already there. Harlan, who wore his second-best coat and stood in the back of the room with his arms crossed and his face in its usual configuration, which was the closest he came to ceremonial expression. Mrs. Portwood from the county clerk's office, who had come because Mara had asked her and because she was the kind of woman who showed up when asked. Miss Aldrich, who had opinions about the Whitaker children that had evolved considerably over the months, and who shook Mara's hand with both of hers afterward. Agnes Calhoun. Fenwick, who had brought something from the mercantile as a gift and delivered it with the awkward generosity of a man who wasn't entirely sure how to be warm but had decided to try. Dr. Hale came. He shook Silas's hand and said, "Good man," which was more than he usually said. The 9 children were all present, in varying degrees of understanding about what was happening and what it meant. Samuel understood that there was food afterward and had positioned himself accordingly. Caleb sat next to Harlan, which had become his default position at any formal occasion. Ruth wore a dress without being told to, which Mara registered as a genuine concession. Lily had been asked if she wanted to play something during the ceremony and had thought about it for 2 days and then said yes. And what she played was 3 minutes of something she'd worked out herself on the harmonica that nobody knew the name of because she'd written it. And it was not polished, and it was not perfect, and it was the most beautiful thing Mara had heard in a long time. George cried a little and pretended he hadn't. Eli stood beside Silas. He had asked the week before if that was all right. He had come to Silas in the barn. Mara had heard about this from Silas, afterward, not from Eli, who would not have told it, and said, in the direct way he'd developed over the months, that he understood Silas wasn't trying to be his father, and he wasn't looking for that, but he wanted to stand beside him if that was acceptable. Silas had said yes. Mara thought about that exchange when she looked at the 2 of them during the ceremony, the man and the boy standing at the same angle, with the same quality of attention, the particular shared posture of people who have worked alongside each other long enough to absorb each other's habits without noticing. Eli had his father's jaw. He was starting to have Silas's stillness. You could lose things and find other things, and the second category did not replace the first. It just added. Life accumulated that way in layers, each one distinct, none of them erasing what was underneath. Mara believed this and had believed it for a long time. But standing in that room, she felt it in the specific physical way that you feel things that are true. The years that followed were not easy in the way that nothing on the frontier was easy, and Mara would not have described them as easy to anyone who asked. The ranch had difficult seasons, and the children had difficult years, and there were arguments and setbacks, and one summer when the water situation was genuinely bad enough that they considered what to do if it didn't break, and it broke but only barely. There was a year when Eli and Silas had a sustained disagreement about the North Pasture expansion that lasted 3 months and involved several conversations that Mara declined to mediate because they were both adults capable of working it out, and eventually they did, and the expansion went forward on a version of Eli's original proposal that neither of them fully acknowledged was Eli's. That was how some things between men got resolved, and Mara left it alone. Clara left at 18 for a teaching certification program in Laramie. She came back 2 years later with the certification and a specific developed opinion about what the Harwick School needed that she shared with Miss Aldrich directly and without softening it, and Miss Aldrich, who had been wanting someone to help manage the growing enrollment, hired her. Clara taught the same children she'd grown up alongside and several of their younger siblings, and she was not the warmest teacher those children ever had. But she was among the most thorough, and the ones who needed thoroughness found it invaluable. Henry went into engineering by a route nobody had planned. He started with the ranch equipment, moved to the mining operations that came through the county, and eventually studied formally through a correspondence program that George helped him identify, because George by then was at a university in Denver and had opinions about which programs were legitimate. Henry built things that lasted. He was not famous for it. He was satisfied with it, which was a different and better condition. May took over the ranch accounts entirely by the time she was 15. With Harlan's formal acknowledgement and Silas's quiet relief. She had a precision with numbers that made the operation genuinely more solvent, and she understood intuitively what the figures meant beyond the figures, what they said about where to put resources, where to pull back, how to read a bad year before it became a catastrophic one. When she was 22, A man from the Territorial Land Office came to the ranch for a completely unrelated matter and spent 3 hours talking to May about the county's agricultural assessment system and went home having hired her as a part-time consultant. She negotiated her own rate. Harlan, who overheard the negotiation, said nothing but revised his professional respect for her upward by a significant margin. George came back from Denver with a degree and a notebook full of writing that he had been working on for 4 years. He sat at Silas's kitchen table, his kitchen table. He'd stopped distinguishing and showed Mara the first chapter of something he was trying to make into a book. It was about Wyoming, about land and law, and the particular mathematics of survival in a territory that did not accommodate sentiment. It was good. She told him so, and then she told him what needed to be stronger, because George needed both. He went back to Denver and came back the next year with a revised draft and the name of a publisher in Chicago who had expressed interest. The book was published when he was 26. It was not widely read at first. Over the years, it was more widely read. George became a person that other writers traveled to talk to, which he was never quite comfortable with but managed gracefully enough. Ruth did not leave. She had never planned to leave. The horses were here, and the work was here, and she had no interest in being anywhere that didn't have both. She built a reputation that was specific, and geographical people brought difficult horses to the Boone Ranch from 3 counties because they'd heard about the woman there who could do things with animals that other trainers couldn't explain. She did not advertise. She didn't need to. By the time she was 20, young men who worked with horses came to ask her questions, and she answered them plainly, and some of them came back as paying clients, and some of them came back for other reasons, and Ruth was politely indifferent to the second category, which only increased the interest. Lily's music was the thing that surprised everyone, including Mara, and Mara had always believed in Lily's ear. A music teacher in Cheyenne agreed to take her as a student when she was 12, which meant an arrangement involving the railway and Miss Aldrich's cousin's household, and a great deal of coordination, all of which Mara managed because it was Lily, and the silence of those early months at the ranch was something Mara had never been able to forget. The teacher said within 6 months that Lily had the kind of instinct that could not be taught. Lily was not prodigious in the public way. She did not perform on stages or seek recognition. She played because the sound was necessary to her in a way she never found adequate words for. Music was the language that Lily's grief had found when ordinary language wasn't enough, and she kept speaking it. Samuel grew into himself with the specific stubbornness of a child who had always known exactly who he was and required only time and space to become it fully. He was, by any honest accounting, difficult, opinionated, loud, not much given to reconsidering his positions once formed. He also had the particular charisma of difficult people, the kind that made rooms pay attention. He became a lawyer, which surprised no one who had watched him argue, since he was old enough to string sentences together. He practiced in Cheyenne and was, by his own regular accounting, extremely good at it. He probably was. Caleb was the one Mara watched most carefully for the longest time, and the one who eventually needed the least watching. His lungs were never entirely strong. He had 2 more significant illnesses before he was 10, both of which Dr. Hale managed, and 1 bad year at 15 that frightened everyone. But he had the stubbornness that small children who survive early illness sometimes developed, a biological obstinacy, a refusal to cooperate with his own fragility. He worked the ranch alongside Eli as he got older, learned everything Eli could teach him, and developed into a man who knew the land the way people knew language, not as a set of facts but as something he thought in. He never left. Neither did Eli. The 3 of them, Silas, Eli, and Caleb, worked those 1,200 acres together for decades, and what they built was not romantic or dramatic. It was solid, which was what land required. On a September afternoon, years into all of this, Mara stood on the porch of the house that was simply her house now, without the qualifier of strangeness it had carried for so long, and watched Ruth work a young horse through a difficult gate in the far pasture. Silas was beside her. He was older, so was she. They had aged the way working people aged, honestly, in increments without much drama about it. The evening light was doing something specific with the land, the way September light did in Wyoming, long and angled and unhurried. The ranch had the late-day sounds it always had. The barn, the animals, somewhere distant, the particular sound of Caleb's voice talking to someone, the creak of the house settling into the cooler air. Mara thought about the station platform, the frozen air, $4.60 and 9 children, and the specific weight of believing that the worst thing that could happen was already happening. She had been wrong about that, and right about something else. The worst thing that could happen was not having nowhere to go. The worst thing was going somewhere that cost you pieces of yourself, a child, a refusal, a compromise you couldn't live with. She had said no to those things in a cold room in front of 6 men who each, in their different ways, had offered her survival at a price she wouldn't pay. What she'd built instead was not rescue. It was not what happened when someone saved you. It was what happened when you stayed long enough and worked hard enough and refused loudly enough that the right circumstances eventually found you because you were still standing in the place where they could. People talked about luck sometimes, about how things worked out. She had thought about that framing for years and she'd never found it quite accurate. Luck was what happened to people who were passive. It fell on them or didn't. What she'd experienced was something different. She had made herself available to better things by refusing to settle for worse ones, and that was not luck. It was a decision, repeated, under conditions where the easier choice was to stop deciding. The harder truth, the one she'd turned over many times and arrived at slowly, was that she had not been a perfect mother through any of it. She had been frightened and sharp-tongued and occasionally wrong, and there had been years when she was so focused on the logistics of survival that the emotional needs of specific children had not received what they deserved. She knew which ones. She had made her repairs where she could and lived with the residue of the rest. That was the reality of raising 9 children through difficult circumstances with limited resources and her own substantial imperfections. Anyone who told a cleaner story was leaving out the real one, but she had not left one behind. That was the thing she could say without qualification. And she said it now to herself, standing on the porch in the September light, as a statement of fact rather than a boast. Not one of them. Not in the station. Not in the weeks when Vernon Crow had applied his particular kind of pressure. Not in the years that followed with their various difficulties. She had held the line on the one thing she'd decided was not negotiable, and everything else, all the complexity and imperfection and accumulated difficulty had been built on that foundation. Ruth brought the young horse through the gate on the 3rd attempt. The horse was resistant in the specific way of animals who are not yet convinced they should do what they're being asked. Ruth gave her time. She always gave them time. She understood. In the particular way, she understood everything about horses, that you could not force an animal to trust you and you could not schedule the moment when they decided to. You could only keep showing up until they did. Mara raised her cup in Ruth's direction across the pasture. Ruth lifted her hand back without turning. She always knew when her mother was watching, had always had that awareness, and kept working. Silas, said George wrote. What does he say? That the new book is going well. That he wants to come back in October. A pause. That Samuel has an opinion about the chapter about land law and wants to argue it at the dinner table. Mara thought about Samuel arguing land law at the dinner table and felt something that was straightforwardly happiness, without complexity. Of course he does. He's probably right. He might be. She looked out at the pasture. Usually is, which makes it worse. The light shifted. In the barn, something moved, probably Caleb, doing the evening round that had been his for years, moving through the tasks of the place with the specific knowledge of a man who has learned a piece of land so thoroughly it has become part of how he thinks. Mara thought about what it meant to belong somewhere. She had spent a long time, in the years before Wyoming, not fully believing in the concept, or rather, believing in it as something that existed for other people, people whose circumstances permitted it. She had thought of belonging as a condition granted by stability, by inheritance, by luck. She understood it differently now. Belonging was not given. It was built slowly, imperfectly, through the accumulation of ordinary days in which you showed up and did the work, and held your ground when something tried to move you. It was the stove that Henry fixed, and the ledger that May corrected, and the harmonica in the study, and the fence posts that Eli had driven into the frozen ground without being asked. It was 9 children who had started as a problem in the minds of every official in Carbon County, and had become, over years, the people who made this particular corner of the territory more itself. Nobody had given them this, they had made it. That was the story she wanted to carry forward, not the romantic version, not the version where things worked out because they were meant to, but the true version, where the woman at the center of it had 4.6 and 9 children, and a will that had not broken under 6 consecutive no's, and had found the one door still open, and had walked through it without losing anything she'd decided not to lose. Where the man who had opened it had asked the right question first, where the children who had been called impossible had become the proof that the word meant nothing, where belonging, which no one had offered them, had been built by their own hands from the materials of ordinary days. Mara set down her cup on the porch railing and looked at the land that was hers earned, not given, known by the particular intimacy of years, and let the September light do what it was going to do. Across the pasture, the young horse stepped through the gate. Ruth's hand came down on its neck, steady and patient, and that was enough.